Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep, so if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, don't forget to tell me where you are from and what time you watched this video. And let's begin. Camping stories began for me around the age of 20, but I had started gathering them when I was only 7. At that age, these stories were a source of comfort. Spending time with Dad hiking, staying safe under his guidance, chasing squirrels to catch and eat, and discovering herbs with their fresh, calming scents. However, there's one story I can never forget. I was just 8 when I went with my father to the Maryland woods, and that night remains one of the most haunting memories of my life. When you're a child, reality has a way of feeling flexible. Everything seems possible, and the world can shift unexpectedly. That night, the shift came, and it changed everything I thought I knew. Dad and I would often visit Grandpa's house on the outskirts of a quiet town. As many retired artists had moved there to live a simple life surrounded by trees and nature. Grandpa's house was old, sitting on the edge of town and surrounded by dense gum trees. The gravel driveway twisted and snaked its way to his home, a path that seemed to take you far from neighbors. The air always carried the scent of fresh herbs and wood, which had always brought me a sense of peace as a child. I used to love those visits. They were the kind of trips that allowed freedom, running in the yard, picking fruit, or chasing after the dogs. But on this particular visit, things took a terrifying turn. After spending time with Grandpa, Dad decided to drive back late one evening. The air was cool, and there was a light breeze as we said our goodbyes. I got into the front seat of the car while Dad exchanged his hug with Grandpa. We began our journey home, the engine humming as we set out down the narrow road. That road is still etched in my memory because of its twisted path and the dense trees lining each side. On a quiet night, the only thing visible outside the windows would be dark trees and the occasional glow of headlights. It was always a bit unnerving, though I couldn't explain why, especially as a child. That night, something felt different. Before even leaving the driveway, I could sense that something was wrong. Dad was silent, no music played, and he wasn't engaging with me as he usually would. His focus was sharp, like that of a new driver, and I could feel tension radiating from him as we started down the road. The trees grew thicker on either side, their branches twisting like grasping hands. The headlights illuminated the path ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. While staring out the window, I saw movement. Came from the corner of my eye near the far end of Grandpa's driveway, close to his garage. Something was moving. At first I thought it was a stray animal, a dog, or maybe even a bird, but as I focused, my stomach sank. It was a person or something that looked very much like a person. It was thin, skeletal, almost drained of life. Its pale skin stretched tight over visible bones. Its arms moved unnaturally as it crawled on all fours across the gravel, hands wide and grasping. Its head was large, and though its face was turned away, the faint glow of its sunken eyes reflected the car headlights. My heart stopped. I stared, unable to move, unable to cry out. I jumped back in my seat, gasping, trying to process what I saw. My hands clenched the edge of the seat. I turned toward my father, desperate. "Dad, there's something weird there," I whispered. He paused the car for a moment, his eyes on the dark road. I could see him trying to figure out what I meant, but his face showed no worry. His voice came steady and calm as he placed a hand on my shoulder. "Don't look there, son. Strange things like that exist in the woods. They harm bad people, but they won't harm us." His calm words shocked me. He hugged me and kissed the top of my head, trying to change the mood. "Come on, let's put on your favorite music and grab some chips. I know you're hungry." He tried to distract me, but my eyes kept going back to where I saw that creature. I pulled out the chips and stared into the dark again, my stomach in knots. When I looked back toward the spot, it was gone. The gravel was empty, no crawling figure, no pale body. I blinked, my breath quickening. Was I dreaming? But then the cold sweat on my face and my racing heart told me otherwise. That thing had been real. I turned back toward Dad, my voice shaking. Did you see that?" For a moment, he didn't answer. Then quietly, he nodded. "Yes, son," he said, his voice low. "I saw it." He gave me a reassuring smile, increasing the volume of the song and driving faster. He handed me a chip and tried to lighten the mood. We drove in silence for the rest of the trip. The road stretched on, and I couldn't stop thinking about what I saw. My mind kept replaying that skeletal figure, its glowing eyes and unnatural movements. Dad tried to change the subject, asking me about school, friends, and games, but nothing worked. I couldn't forget it. Before we left the outskirts, we stopped at a small convenience store. We grabbed ice cream cones and some ramen, and Dad talked about how he used to face his own fears as a kid. He shared a story about getting scared, having to be cheered up by Grandpa at the ice cream shop, and that moment managed to pull a small laugh from me. When we made it back home, the night air felt heavier than usual, as though the world was holding its breath. I couldn't shake the sensation that what we had seen was more than a trick of the light or a random accident. It lingered in my chest, a feeling that whatever had been there in the dark woods might still be out there. That night, my mother stayed with me. She probably knew what had happened, though Dad never said anything. She held me close, her presence soothing, but not enough to erase the image from my mind. It's been many years since then. I'm about to enter high school, and I've had many trips to forests since. Yet that night remains with me, a chilling memory. I've come to believe that there are places in this world where things don't quite follow the rules, places where you see things that can't be explained, things you can never forget. Grandpa's property was one of those places. What I saw that night will never leave me, and I know I'll never truly understand it. All I can say is this: some things should never remain hidden in the dark, and some creatures should never crawl across gravel roads waiting to be seen. Hiking through the dense woods has always been a soothing way to clear my mind. But I never imagined that one event would completely shift how I view the forest. Sometimes, a single experience can change your life forever, shaping you into a shadow of your former self. For me, that change was a descent into something much darker. Before that event, the mountains felt like a refuge. They were where I could reconnect with myself, finding peace and solitude. I would meet other hikers on the trail, sharing stories and realizing just how vast the world truly is. There was joy in sitting by a lake, tossing stones across the ripples, but all of that was stripped away in an instant. I've never shared the full story with anyone, but maybe putting it into words will help me come to terms with what happened. It was 2020, a cool autumn morning, when I decided to take a solo hiking trip over the weekend. I wasn't in the mood for adventure, so I chose a trail I knew well. The path was quiet and familiar, with the occasional hiker here and there, but no more than 5 at a time. I love taking photographs, and this particular trail offered some of the most breathtaking views around. The night before, I'd packed everything I needed: water, snacks, a flashlight, and my phone to capture the scenery. My plan was simple: reach a familiar clearing, relax for a while, and return to the car before sunset. The sound of wind rustling through the trees, leaves crunching underfoot, and birds or other wildlife in the distance had always been comforting to me. But as I began my way back to the trailhead late in the afternoon, something felt off. About 100 yards from my car, I noticed a small campsite. When I passed by earlier, it had appeared neat and well-maintained, with a tent set up, a folded chair, and a small pile of firewood. Now, however, it looked entirely different. The tent was collapsed, the chair overturned, and supplies scattered across the ground. Clothing, a backpack, and even hiking boots lying haphazardly. At first I thought perhaps wild animals had gotten into the campsite. Bears roamed this area, and they could be destructive when searching for food. But as I got closer, I felt an unease that I couldn't shake. There were no claw marks, no evidence of rummaging through supplies. Just sheer chaos, as if someone had left in a hurry or had been interrupted. I called out, "Hello? Anyone here?" But the only answer was silence. I debated leaving, convincing myself that whatever had happened there wasn't my problem. Still, curiosity held me. I couldn't stop myself from exploring. Near the edge of the campsite, I spotted a trail of footprints leading into the woods. They were faint but visible in the soft dirt. The prints didn't look like typical hiking boot impressions. There were deeper, misshapen marks alongside them, as though something heavy had been dragged through the forest. My mind raced as I wondered whether this could have been the result of animals or humans. but the odd trail only deepened my confusion. Following the footprints brought me to the mouth of a cave I hadn't noticed before. It was partially concealed by overgrown bushes and jagged rocks. The air that emerged from the cave was colder, carrying a faint, unpleasant odor. My instincts screamed at me to leave, to retreat and forget this place ever existed. But then I heard something, a wet, slithering sound, coming from inside the cave. My heart pounded as I crouched behind a rock and tried to peer into the dark. That's when I saw it. A creature emerged from the shadows, gray skeletal, with elongated limbs that didn't seem built to move like that. Its skin was stretched taut over its bones, and it moved with jerky, insect-like motions. In its grasp, it dragged something or someone across the cave floor. A man's arm dangled lifelessly as the creature pulled it deeper into the darkness. I froze, my hand covering my mouth, struggling to suppress a gasp. Fear paralyzed me. What was this? What was I looking at? The creature froze, its head snapping upward as though sensing me. I ducked lower, barely breathing. When I mustered the courage to look again, it had disappeared. But then I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. Another figure emerged from the woods, pulling a woman behind it. Her long hair trailed in the dirt as she was dragged toward the cave. My stomach turned, and I felt bile rising. I stumbled backward, my foot catching on a root. I fell hard to the ground. The noise drew the attention of both creatures. Their glowing eyes locked onto mine. Time felt like it froze. A guttural screech came from their throats, and they began moving toward me. I can't remember much of what happened next. My body moved on instinct. I scrambled to my feet, running faster than I ever thought possible. The forest blurred around me as I wove through trees, my lungs burning with each breath. The screeches faded as I approached the trailhead, and finally, my car came into view. I fumbled with my keys, my hands trembling, nearly dropping them in my panic. I forced myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door shut, and locked it. The engine roared to life as I sped down the dirt road, kicking up a cloud of dust behind me. I didn't dare look in the rearview mirror. I was too afraid of what I might see. When I reached the main road, I pulled over, my chest heaving, my hands gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. What had just happened? My mind swam, trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Couldn't calm down. I spotted a nearby motel sign in the distance and saw it as a refuge. I parked there, went through the motions of checking in, and found myself in a small, dingy room that at that moment felt like safety. I stayed there, trying to distract myself with coffee, biscuits, and TV shows. Nothing helped. The images haunted me. The glowing eyes, the gaunt bodies, the lifeless figures being dragged into the cave. Exhaustion eventually took over, and I fell into a troubled sleep, plagued by nightmares. Each time I drifted off, I found myself back in the forest, running, terrified, as those creatures pursued me. For years have passed since that day, but the memories haven't faded. I haven't set foot in the mountains again. I've tried convincing myself it was a hallucination, something my mind invented out of stress or exhaustion. But I know better. Those creatures were real. I saw them. I'll never forget the sound of their screeches, the feel of their presence, or the sight of the lifeless bodies they dragged into the cave. Some things aren't meant to be uncovered. Some mysteries should stay hidden. The forest that once felt like peace has become a place of dread, a lesson I learned in the worst way. The deep woods have always felt like a refuge to me, especially the forests of Tennessee. They held a unique kind of mystery ever since I was in my early 20s. As a child, I would often find myself wandering their endless stretches, where the oaks seemed to touch the sky like ancient guardians, and the whispers of the wind carried secrets as old as the earth itself. These woods were my playground, my mentor, and my safe haven. But on one fateful day in November, they revealed a darkness I could never have imagined. That morning, Grandpa and I packed our gear and rifles into his old truck and drove toward our favorite hunting spot, deep in the woods. Grandpa had spent his entire life hunting these lands, and it was tradition for us to spend crisp autumn weekends tracking deer and sitting by the fire, sharing stories. The drive was always a peaceful time, allowing Grandpa his usual rants about how city people no longer respected the land. I smiled and nodded, knowing that his words came from a deep love for the woods and all they provided for us. By the time we reached the trailhead, the sun was rising, casting long shadows across the frost-covered earth. The air was sharp and still, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and wet leaves. It was the kind of morning that every hunter dreams of, when every sound and motion feels alive with promise. As we walked through the underbrush, Grandpa fell into his usual rhythm, spotting animal tracks and broken branches like he was reading a book about the woods. "See that?" he said, pointing to a patch of disturbed soil. "Deer bedded here last night. Bet they're still close." I nodded, my eyes scanning the area ahead. But as we ventured further, the forest began to change. The familiar bird songs that usually accompanied our walks grew slower and eventually disappeared entirely. The rustling leaves and the chatter of squirrels fell away, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. "Grandpa," I whispered, my voice barely breaking the stillness. "Why is it so quiet?" He stopped, his eyes scanning the treetops. "The woods are thinking," he said, his voice low and deliberate. "What does that mean?" I asked. "It means we're not alone," he replied, his hand resting on his rifle. "Stay close." We moved forward, the oppressive quiet wrapping itself around us. Every snap of a twig or distant rustle sent my heart into my throat. I'd hunted with Grandpa countless times, but I'd never felt this way before. Ahead, about 50 yards in a small clearing, we saw it, a buck standing still. It was a majestic animal, its antlers branching out like a crown, but something about it felt wrong. Its head was hanging low, its movements sluggish, and its coat had an unnatural sheen as though it were wet. "Take the shot," Grandpa whispered, his voice steady despite the unease in his eyes. I raised my rifle, aiming for its chest, my finger hovering over the trigger. But I hesitated. There was something about the way it stood, its head cocked slightly as though it was observing me. My stomach churned. "Shoot!" Grandpa urged, more insistently this time. I fired, and the shot rang out through the trees. The buck staggered, but didn't fall. Instead, it turned and bolted into the underbrush, moving with surprising speed and grace. "Damn!" Grandpa muttered. "Must have just grazed it. Let's track it." We followed the trail of blood across the frost-covered leaves. The deeper we went into the woods, the darker it seemed to become. The trees grew larger, their gnarled branches twisting like skeletal hands overhead. The air turned colder, and the silence became almost unbearable. After about 20 minutes, we found it, or what was left of it. The buck lay in a clearing, its body torn apart, its ribs stuck out like jagged spears, and its insides were completely gone, as if something had hollowed it out with surgical precision. But there was no blood, not a single drop. "What in the hell?" Grandpa muttered, his voice trailing off. I took a step closer, my stomach twisting at the sight. "What could do this?" Grandpa didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the carcass, his face pale. Then we heard it, a low, guttural growl that sent chills running through me. It was unlike any sound I'd ever heard, a deep, primal growl that seemed to resonate through the trees like a warning. "Get your rifle," Grandpa whispered, his voice shaking. I fumbled for my weapon, my hands trembling. The growl came again, closer this time. I saw it then, at first just a shadow moving between the trees. But as it stepped into the clearing, my breath froze in my chest. It was enormous, standing at least 7 feet tall on 2 long, emaciated legs. Its skin was stretched tight over its bones, and its arms ended in claw-like hands that twitched with anticipation. Its face was the worst part, a grotesque, distorted version of the buck we had been tracking, its hollow eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "Run!" Grandpa hissed, his voice barely audible. "What?" I stammered, unable to look away from the creature. "Run!" he shouted, raising his rifle and firing. The sound of the shot snapped me out of my trance, and I turned, bolting on pure instinct. My legs carried me forward, my heart pounding, lungs burning. Behind me I heard the crack of another gunshot, followed by a guttural roar that shook the ground. I didn't stop running until I reached the truck. I climbed inside, my chest heaving. I didn't dare look back. Minutes later, Grandpa emerged from the woods, his face pale and his hands shaking. He didn't say a word as he climbed into the truck and started the engine. As we drove away, I broke the silence. "What was that?" Grandpa shook his head, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "I don't know, and I don't want to know. We never spoke of it again. Not that day, not ever. But the memory haunted me. living in my dreams and gnawing at the edges of my thoughts. Years later, I still avoid those woods. Some things are better left forgotten. Yet every now and then I catch myself glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see those hollow eyes watching from the shadows. The woods took that buck back, and they almost took us too. Hunting nightmares could be frightening, but for me, hunting wasn't about the kill. It was about those peaceful moments in nature, the way the world seemed to hold its breath in the soft glow of morning and the crisp, clean air. It was an escape from life's noise, a way to connect with something ancient and untouched. But this trip, the one I'm about to share, changed everything. It was late October in 2020 when I set off alone on a hunting trip deep in the mountains. The leaves had turned shades of red and orange, and the air carried a slight chill. The woods were alive with sound, the kind of sound that feels natural and timeless. I had been out for 3 days already, and the hunt had been uneventful. I'd seen a few deer, but they were always too far off or too young. That morning, I decided to head toward the eastern ridge, a less traveled part of the mountain where I had been successful in the past. The day moved slowly as I navigated through the woods, scanning for any sign of movement. By the time afternoon rolled in, the sun was sinking lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the forest floor. That's when I spotted a deer standing still about 50 yards away. There was something strange about it. Its body was thin, almost skeletal, and its fur was patchy and lifeless. Its head hung low, and its breathing sounded labored, every exhale forming faint clouds in the cold air. I'd encountered sick animals before, but this felt different. The deer looked off. It seemed unnatural, as though it didn't belong here. Every hunter has moments like this, moments when instinct and logic clash. I hesitated, torn. The thought of leaving it behind and its suffering gnawed at me. It didn't feel right. Slowly, I raised my bow and drew the string back as quietly as I could. The deer didn't move, didn't flinch. Its eyes were unfocused, as though staring right through me. I released the arrow, and it struck true, embedding itself deep into the deer's side. That should have been the end of it. But then, the deer let out a terrible guttural screech that made my blood freeze. It didn't collapse. Instead, its body began to twist and contort in ways that felt unnatural. My heart pounded as I watched it rise, not on 4 legs, but on 2. Its limbs stretched and reshaped themselves, bending and cracking as they moved. Its neck snapped upright, and its face shifted into something both horrifying and human-like. Its eyes, once dull, glowed faintly with an ominous light. Its mouth split open to reveal jagged teeth dripping with saliva. I stumbled back, my bow falling from my hands. My mind couldn't process what I was seeing. It wasn't real, couldn't be real. The creature took a step toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural. I tried to grab another arrow, but my hands were shaking too hard. It let out another screech, and I panicked. I turned and ran, branches slapping my face and the ground shifting underfoot as I sprinted through the trees. Behind me, I could hear it crashing through the underbrush, its growls sending waves of terror through me. I don't know how far I ran. Eventually, the sounds of pursuit faded. My lungs felt like they would burst, and my legs felt ready to give out. I found a large tree and crouched behind it, struggling to catch my breath. The woods had gone quiet, so quiet that even the birds seemed to have stopped chirping. After what felt like hours, I gathered the courage to return to my camp. My thoughts swirled in a whirlwind of fear and disbelief. What had I just seen? Was it some kind of predator I didn't know about, or something entirely different? When I finally reached my camp, my heart sank. Everything had been destroyed. My tent was in tatters, the fabric shredded and caught on the poles. My supplies were scattered, my cooler overturned. My gear lay broken, thrown about as though by a powerful force. Even the fire pit had been disturbed, rocks scattered as though a giant had been pacing there. And then I noticed the footprints. They were enormous, far larger than any humans, and deep in the dirt. The shape of them was wrong, elongated toes with claw-like impressions at the tips. They crisscrossed the camp erratically, as if something had lingered there for a long time. I didn't stay to investigate further. I grabbed whatever I could, a water bottle, a flashlight, my knife, and fled down the mountain as quickly as I could, sticking to the trail. The entire way down, I felt eyes on me. felt like the creature was waiting just beyond the trees, watching. By the time I reached my truck, the sun had set and darkness had fallen. I jumped into the vehicle, locked the doors, and drove away without looking back. My hands shook so hard I could barely grip the wheel, and my mind felt blank with fear and confusion. When I finally made it home, I promised myself I wouldn't tell anyone about what had happened. Who would believe me? They would think I was crazy or making it up. So I lied. When friends asked about my trip, I said everything was fine. I said I hadn't had much luck but had enjoyed the peace of the woods. But the truth has haunted me every single day since. I've spent countless hours trying to find an explanation. The closest I've come are old legends, stories of skinwalkers, wendigos, and other creatures said to haunt the deep woods. But they're just myths, right? Campfire tales to frighten children. Except I know what I saw. I haven't gone back to those mountains. The thought of the woods, of that thing, fills me with a fear I can't shake. I don't know what it was, but it wasn't just an animal. Some things are meant to stay unknown. Some places aren't meant to be disturbed. The mountains, once a place of peace, have become a place of nightmares, and I'll never return. Camping has always been my greatest passion, but the tales I've gathered from it are chilling, especially a few that still send shivers down my spine. The wilderness harbors mysteries that defy explanation, enigmas crafted not by humans, but by spirits, wild creatures, and nature itself. Nature can deceive anyone in an instant, and that's exactly what happened to Ethan, my closest friend, and me 2 decades ago. We embarked on a weekend camping trip to the forests of eastern Oregon, and the experience has haunted us ever since. On our way back, we couldn't exchange a single word, breaking our tradition of monthly forest getaways. We needed time to confront the terror of what unfolded. The trip started like any other. Ethan and I packed our supplies into his weathered SUV, teased each other about my clumsy hiking skills compared to his, and headed towards an untouched section of the Cascade Mountain Range. This was new territory for us, a wild and uncharted stretch of forest that had an almost magnetic allure. The mountains loomed tall and forbidding, their summits cloaked in mist. The stillness of the place felt heavy, as if the air itself was charged with anticipation. By early afternoon, we had set up camp near a clearing with a decent view of the valley below. The spot was breathtaking, surrounded by towering pines and ancient oaks whose interlaced branches filtered the sunlight, creating a dim, almost cathedral-like atmosphere. We pitched our tent, kindled a small fire, and spent the day exploring trails and taking in the rugged beauty around us. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest grew eerily quiet. No insects chirped, no leaves rustled, and no distant animals howled. The silence was oppressive, amplifying every creak of a branch or crunch of soil underfoot. It was the kind of silence that made you feel like unseen eyes were watching your every move. But Ethan and I dismissed the unease, laughing it off as nerves and turning in early to prepare for the pre-dawn hours, prime for scouting wildlife. We drifted off without trouble, used to the forest's quirks. But sometime past midnight, a piercing scream ripped through the stillness, jolting us upright in our sleeping bags. My mind scrambled to identify the source, animal or human. The unrelenting, high-pitched wail confirmed it was human. My stomach nodded as the sound echoed through the trees. I whispered to Ethan, "Did you hear that?" His wide eyes told me he had. "Yeah, stay quiet." We listened, hearts pounding, trying to pinpoint the direction of the noise. Just as abruptly as it started, the scream stopped. The silence returned, but it felt even heavier. Then, faintly at first, a voice emerged, calling Ethan's name. It was a soft, drawn-out whisper, carried by the wind. The sound froze my blood. It felt otherworldly, as though something unseen was beckoning him. "Who's out there?" Ethan muttered, clutching his flashlight and rifle. I didn't answer, my throat too dry to form words. Against my protests, he decided to investigate, urging me to follow. Reluctantly, I grabbed my rifle, every step through the underbrush feeling like a betrayal of common sense. The voice called again, closer now, its tone almost playful. My pulse raced as I realized whatever was calling knew us. "Show yourself," Ethan shouted, his voice cutting through the oppressive quiet. Only the faint sound of snapping branches answered. Suddenly something lunged from the darkness, a blur of motion and pale skin. Before I could process it, Ethan was tackled to the ground. I aimed my rifle at the attacker, my hands trembling, and fired. The shot echoed through the trees, and the figure let out a guttural snarl before vanishing into the shadows. Ethan scrambled to his feet, blood dripping from a wound on his forehead. "We have to leave," he gasped. Grabbing what little we could, we sprinted back to the truck, ignoring the branches and brambles clawing at us. We drove to a nearby campsite populated by other campers, where we spent the rest of the night, huddled in fear. The next morning, we reported the incident to the local authorities, who listened with skepticism but agreed to investigate. When we returned to the site with the sheriff, the evidence was unsettling. A recently extinguished campfire, a few scattered supplies, and trampled underbrush suggested someone or something had been there. But there were no footprints, no signs of departure, nothing to explain what we'd encountered. The sheriff dismissed our story, warning us to steer clear of the area. The investigation went nowhere, leaving us with unanswered questions. That night marked the end of our camping trips. What had once been our sanctuary now felt like a place to be avoided. Even after 20 years, the memory remains vivid. The haunting voice, the oppressive silence, and the shadowy figures. Some things in this world are beyond understanding, and some places are best left unexplored. I've never returned to those woods, and I never will. My boyfriend and I, both in our early 20s, decided to escape the grind of school and work for a short getaway. We planned a weekend camping trip to a nearby stretch of the Blue Ridge hiking trails, part of a larger national trail system. After finishing my Friday shift at a cafe, we set out, determined not to let anything ruin our plan. I managed to clock out around 4 p.m., and by 5:30 we were on the trail, backpacks loaded. My boyfriend, a former scout, made sure we had all the essentials, along with a little something to help us relax later. The hike began with a grueling uphill climb. Each of us carried a 40-pound metal frame pack, and the humidity made every step harder. An hour later, we passed a basic trail shelter, a 3-walled wooden structure meant for hikers to rest or escape bad weather. As we pushed on, the sky darkened, and the rain began pouring down. The forest filled with thick fog, the trail became slippery, and our progress slowed significantly. By the time night fell, we were drenched, exhausted, and freezing. We stopped briefly to locate our headlamps and then resumed our trek, carefully navigating the rocky, muddy path. Around 8:30 p.m., we reached a junction near the second shelter. The trail split. One path led to a scenic overlook, another to the campsite, and a third descended to the shelter. Given the relentless rain, setting up our tent was impossible, so we opted to take refuge in the shelter until the storm eased. As we approached the shelter, we were relieved to find it already occupied, but not by the boisterous group we'd feared. Instead, an older couple, likely in their early 60s, greeted us warmly. They introduced themselves as Gary and Linda. They seemed like an ordinary pair, escaping their routines for a weekend, much like us. Gary had brought along a friendly dog, which I happily played with while we dried off. They offered us a lantern and a towel, and we shared small talk. Our names, where we were from, and our reasons for being there. Linda, who claimed to be a writer, struck me as peculiar. She had wiry gray hair, round glasses, and wore hiking boots with shorts that barely covered her legs. Her teeth were dark and stained, as if from years of bad habits. Gary, on the other hand, was unremarkable, slightly overweight with thinning gray hair. Between stories, they took big swigs from hydration packs that clearly didn't contain water. The conversation soon veered off, revealing hints that they might be having an affair. Despite my initial irritation, I began to relax after a few puffs from what we'd brought along, and they even joined in. Gary took a couple of hesitant drags, while Linda, surprisingly, indulged enthusiastically, fumbling with the lighter. It was strange, but amusing at first. As Gary and my boyfriend talked, Linda started asking me odd questions. She moved closer, almost invading my space, and repeatedly demanded, "Tell me a story." I tried to deflect by mentioning how my boyfriend and I met online, thinking it might interest her since Gary had earlier said they met online too. Her reaction was jarring. She interrupted, her tone sharp. "Why would you say that?" Confused, I repeated, "You both met online, right?" She grew increasingly agitated, snapping, "Why do you keep saying that?" Hoping to change the subject, I asked about her writing. Her mood flipped instantly. She grinned and said in an airy voice, "I'm a writer in my mind." Her erratic behavior unnerved me. She started talking to herself, making elaborate hand gestures, and then accusing me of saying things I hadn't. Things escalated quickly. Linda began rocking back and forth, waving her arms and muttering nonsense. She then shouted, "I'm calling them out, witchcraft," as thunder rolled in the distance. The storm's intensity made the scene even more terrifying. Gary tried to calm her down, but she continued mumbling incoherently. Eventually, he told her to lie down. She struggled to get into her sleeping bag, finally curling up on top of it. Just as we thought things had settled, Linda whispered harshly, "What did you give me?" She repeated the question louder each time until she yelled it at Gary. Her eyes, nearly black with dilated pupils, glared at us as she demanded, "What did he give me?" My boyfriend and I froze, unsure of what to do. Linda leaned close to Gary and whispered, "Did you give me something?" Her behavior made me wonder if she was experiencing a drug flashback. After a few restless minutes, Linda sat up again, crossed her legs, and stared directly at us without blinking. This unnerving pattern continued, lying down, then sitting up and staring. Finally, we decided to leave. We quietly gathered our gear, slipped out into the rain, and hiked far enough away to feel safe. We set up our tent in the dark, but I couldn't sleep. Every rustle in the woods made me fear Linda might find us. Hello, this took place around July earlier this year. I'm unsure what we experienced or if it was anything supernatural, but here's the story. It's a bit long, so I appreciate your patience. This happened while we were on a hike to Eagle Peak. Our campsite was about a 25-minute drive from the trailhead. The group included me, a 19-year-old guy, my cousin, a 33-year-old man, and his friend, let's call him T. There were also 2 other girls with us, but they don't play much of a role in this story. My cousin and T are both religious, so there weren't any substances involved that could explain the events. We set up camp, had dinner, and planned to wake up at 4 a.m. to begin the hike by 4:30. Around 3:20 a.m., I woke up suddenly, feeling completely alert. I looked out from my tent, and there was an unusual sense of stillness. The moonlight was unusually bright, and I remember thinking it felt like something out of a dream. I tried going back to sleep, but couldn't. Eventually, I woke my cousin and T at about 3:45 a.m. As soon as my cousin woke up, he asked, "Were you walking around earlier?" I said no, and asked why. He explained that he woke up and distinctly heard footsteps, not like an animal, but a person. We shrugged it off and decided to get going. We arrived at the trailhead around 4:30 a.m. T mentioned he needed to use the restroom. There were bathrooms just before the start of the trail, so he headed that way. I walked with him for a bit, then waited for my cousin, who was grabbing something from the car. The parking lot road led straight to a T-junction, with the bathrooms located across a small field at the intersection. Those who've been there will know the layout. We waited at the intersection for T, but after about 10 minutes, I went to check. The restroom was empty. I went back to my cousin and told him, and he thought maybe T had returned to the car. By 5:10, we were getting concerned. My cousin checked the car while I stayed at the intersection in case T showed up. When my cousin returned saying T wasn't at the car, we decided to check the trailhead in case he'd gone ahead. After 10 minutes of walking, he wasn't there either. Frustrated and worried, I ran back to the car and bathrooms to check again. This time, I bumped into T halfway to the intersection. He looked disheveled, sweaty, and had an odd expression. I asked, "Where were you?" He said he'd gone to the bathroom and returned to the intersection, but didn't see us. I told him we'd been waiting for over an hour, checking everywhere. He just repeated that he'd gone to the bathroom. Then he asked twice where my cousin was, which felt strange. I answered both times, and we walked toward the trailhead. On the way, T pointed out a light by the riverbank, saying, "Maybe that's him." I just shook my head and kept walking. His behavior was unsettling, like he wasn't entirely present. The rest of the hike seemed mostly normal, except for a few odd things. We kept losing items, my cousin's small flashlight, a glove belonging to one of the girls, and a water bottle. It was like the items simply disappeared. On the way back, it got dark and we used flashlights. After the last waterfall, it felt like we were walking for much longer than usual. The trail seemed endless, and nothing looked familiar. I've done this hike several times and know the landmarks, but this time they were absent. Even my cousin said, "Doesn't it feel like we've been walking forever?" I agreed, and we laughed nervously, trying to lighten the mood. There was a strange energy in the air, a feeling hard to describe, almost like the forest itself was watching us. It wasn't oppressive, but it was unsettling. After what felt like ages, we suddenly emerged onto the final stretch and made it back to the car. At the time, it all seemed odd, but we didn't dwell on it too much. It wasn't until later that I realized just how strange the series of events was. My cousin seems to view things differently now, and honestly, so do I. I wanted to share this experience and see if anyone has any thoughts or explanations. Years back, my niece and I set out on a camping and fishing trip to a peaceful spot near Cedar Ridge, Virginia. Known for its lush scenery and tranquil rivers, we chose to camp in a state-managed area by the Shenandoah River, hoping for a quiet escape from daily routines. The campground was spread out with sites distanced for privacy, giving it an air of isolation. We picked the last site at the far edge of the grounds, far from other visitors seeking solitude. The Shenandoah's gentle current added a calming soundtrack, while the surrounding forest buzzed with the sounds of wildlife. The day was spent setting up camp, pitching the tent, arranging supplies, and collecting firewood. The weather was ideal. A mild breeze whispered through the trees, and sunlight filtered through the leafy canopy in soft patterns. We fished along the river's edge, chatting and enjoying the companionship such trips bring. As twilight fell, we lit a campfire, the flames flickering warmly in the growing darkness. The forest transitioned into night, with the chirping birds gradually replaced by nocturnal calls. Everything was serene, just the usual symphony of the wild. Then, around 10 or 11 p.m., something unexpected occurred. A woman's voice began singing in the woods. The melody lacked discernible words, but was hauntingly beautiful. It resonated through the trees, captivating and unnerving at the same time. I glanced at my niece, seated across the fire. Her wide eyes reflected unease. Our dog, previously resting by the fire, sprang to attention, ears alert and eyes fixed on the dark woods. His reaction, given his usual calm nature, heightened my concern. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. My niece, visibly pale in the firelight, muttered, "I don't hear anything. I'm going to sleep." Her denial was unconvincing, as the melody was clearly audible. It was obvious she was scared and hoped ignoring it might make it go away. The singing persisted, seemingly coming from a single direction, yet impossible to pinpoint. The sound felt omnipresent, as though it emanated from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Oddly, it didn't feel malicious, just eerily beautiful and otherworldly. I suggested exploring with a flashlight to locate the source, but my niece refused, retreating quickly into the tent. Left alone with the dog, I stood by the fire, listening intently. The melody continued for several minutes, weaving through the night air. Both the dog and I remained motionless, staring into the dense darkness of the woods. The fire's glow a fragile barrier between us and the unknown. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the singing ceased. The forest returned to its usual stillness, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. Relief mixed with curiosity. It seemed impossible for someone to have hidden in the forest without my dog noticing earlier. His alert yet calm demeanor reassured me that whatever we'd heard wasn't a direct threat, but it was undeniably strange. The next morning, my niece finally admitted to hearing the singing, but had been too frightened to acknowledge it. We tried to rationalize the experience, considering echoes, wildlife, or even another camper, but none of these explanations quite fit. In the days that followed, I searched online for similar accounts near the Cedar Ridge area, but found nothing conclusive. To this day, the experience remains an unsolved mystery, an eerie yet unforgettable chapter in our camping adventures, a reminder of the unexplainable phenomena that sometimes emerge in the wilderness. A couple of winters ago, just a few weeks before New Year's Eve, I was driving down a remote country road with my brother late at night in southern England. We were navigating through a dense forest when my car lost traction on a sharp bend. The vehicle skidded, veering off the road, and we ended up crashing into a ditch that bordered a farmer's field. Although shaken, both of us were unharmed, but the car wasn't so lucky. The front bumper was hanging off, and one of the wheels had detached completely. We climbed out of the vehicle and tried to call my partner, but he was working late and didn't pick up. With no other options, we stood in the frosty field, hoping he'd eventually check his phone. After some time, a kind, middle-aged woman stopped her car and suggested we head to her nearby village to get her husband, who had tools and a tow rope that could help us. Grateful, we waited in the freezing cold for her husband to arrive. However, an hour went by, and there was still no sign of them returning. At that point, a truck pulled up, and two men climbed out. They spoke with heavy accents and offered to tow us out. Their truck seemed fully equipped for the task, but something deep inside me screamed not to trust them. Despite the biting cold and isolation, with nothing but dark woods and empty fields around, I politely declined. They left, but less than 10 minutes later, they came back. This time, they insisted they couldn't leave us stranded and wanted to help. Their persistence made my unease grow stronger, and my gut told me something wasn't right. I refused their help again, but this time they ignored my protests and started walking toward us. What happened next is a blur. The next clear memory I have is of a completely different man pulling up in another vehicle. He quickly assessed the situation, attached a tow rope to my car, and even had a spare tire on hand, which he used to make the car drivable for the short trip to where my partner was working. It turned out this man was the husband of the kind woman we'd spoken to earlier. Oddly enough, though, when he arrived, he said he hadn't seen any truck or the two men I described. According to him, when his wife told him about us, he left immediately and drove straight to where we were stranded. There was no way the timing added up for everything that had occurred before his arrival. To make things stranger, when I later discussed it with my brother, he had no recollection of the men in the truck. He only remembered waiting for the woman's husband to arrive. To this day, I can't make sense of what happened. Who were those men in the truck? Were they a bad omen? Spirits? Something else entirely? And why is it that my brother remembers none of it? The whole incident leaves me wondering if we somehow slipped into a strange pocket of time or reality. I've worked as a park ranger for nearly 6 years now. I prefer not to reveal the exact location, so please don't ask where these events took place. With that said, I want to make it clear that I'm no expert on the supernatural or unexplained creatures. Most of what I've encountered remains a mystery to me. Perhaps some of you can help shed light on it. Let me start with the first strange encounter I had during one of my patrols. We received a report about a possible trespasser. Trespassers are individuals who stray from marked paths, either getting lost or engaging in activities they shouldn't. It's common for teenagers to think it's thrilling to sneak off into the woods to hang out or smoke. Anyway, I answered the call and began taking the ranger trails to locate the individual. The description I was given was vague, just someone tall and thin. It wasn't much to go on, but it was better than nothing. I was nearing the end of a particular trail when I heard something to the east. I turned to look and caught a glimpse of movement, a flash of color, before it disappeared behind a tree. I called out, "Hey, this area is restricted to park staff only." No response. Nobody stepped out. I moved closer to investigate. To my astonishment, when I got to the tree where I'd seen the figure vanish, there was nothing there. In dense woods, it's hard to move around quietly, but there were no signs of anyone. I reported the incident to my supervisor, who told me to sweep the area one more time before returning. After another patrol, I still found nothing and returned to give him my report. When he asked me what I saw, I described the figure as wearing a red plaid shirt and blue jeans. He chuckled and said, "Ah, you probably saw Jacob." I was confused. "Jacob? Who's that?" I asked. "Hard to reprimand a ghost," he replied casually. Then he explained. Jacob was a young man who had been attacked by a bear in this forest about 16 years ago. Ever since, there have been occasional sightings of him. From that point on, I encountered Jacob a few more times. Besides him, I've seen other strange figures as well. One that stands out happened during a tour I was giving of the campgrounds. I was guiding a small group when a woman raised her hand and asked, "Are we allowed near the riverbank?" She pointed to a spot by the water where I noticed a woman in a long white dress. "Yes, but only if everyone wears a life jacket," I replied. "You can't swim there, The current is too strong. The life jackets are just a safety measure. I called out to the woman by the water. "Ma'am, could you please join us up here? It's not safe down there." She slowly turned her head to look at me. When she did, my blood ran cold. Her eyes were gone, just empty, black sockets. Some in the group gasped, and a few children clung to their parents in fear. I glanced back at the group, who looked at me for answers I didn't have. When I turned back, the woman had vanished. The rest of the tour continued in uneasy silence. When people learn what I do for a living, they often ask if I believe in Bigfoot. My short answer is no, but my longer answer is that there are far stranger and scarier things out there. One last story before I wrap up. I hesitate to share this because it might reveal too much about where I work, and I don't want people coming here for the wrong reasons. I was patrolling one evening when something darted in front of my vehicle, an ATV. Thinking I might have hit a small deer or similar animal, I stopped and radioed my lead ranger. He asked for a description, but I struggled to explain. The creature was about the size of a large dog with shiny black fur. Its body resembled that of a German shepherd, but it had no visible ears, or even any sign that ears had ever been there. Its face was flat and sharp, with small slits where its nose should have been. My supervisor arrived shortly after, just as puzzled as I was. The local wildlife authorities were called, and they took the creature away to study it further. Some campers had snapped pictures, and while the story made it into a newspaper article, thankfully it didn't go beyond that. As far as I know, there have been no updates on what the creature could be. I hope you found my stories interesting, and maybe they'll encourage you to share your own. Depending on the response, I might share a few more tales, but for now, I'll leave it at this. When I was 7, my parents enrolled me in a local wilderness club for kids. Despite what you're about to hear, I still think it was one of the best things I've ever been part of. I loved exploring nature, learning outdoor skills, and all that fun stuff. Since a lot of our activities took place in the woods and revolved around wildlife, you'd expect me to have at least one creepy story to share. Well, I do, and this one has stuck with me. By the time this happened, I'd been in the wilderness club for about a year. That day, we were learning something about identifying different kinds of leaves in the forest. I don't exactly remember the specifics, but that's not the important part. Once the lesson ended, we were split into pairs and given a task: find the largest leaf we could. It might sound a bit silly, but we thought it was a blast. We were told not to wander too far from the group leader, but the boy I was paired with had other ideas. He kept glancing back to see if the leader was watching. The moment they looked away, he bolted deeper into the trees. Now, we had been taught to use the whistle they gave us if we got separated. But in that moment, I wasn't thinking about it. Instead, I made the unwise decision to chase after him, yelling, "We're not supposed to go out there." He didn't stop. Eventually, he slowed down and turned to face me. He was about 9, a couple of years older than I was, so when I saw him with a candy stick that looked like a cigarette, I wasn't shocked. My parents smoked back then, and I assumed older kids liked to imitate that. "We need to head back," I told him, realizing I couldn't see the leader anymore. He just laughed and pretended to take a puff from his cigarette. "Fine," I said. "I'll just call for help." I reached for my whistle, but before I could blow it, he knocked it out of my hand. "Don't you dare get me in trouble, or I'll make you regret it," he warned. I believed him. He was taller and likely stronger than me. He laughed for a moment, but then his expression changed. He froze, staring at something behind me. At first, I thought one of the group leaders had found us, but his face told me it was something much worse. He dropped the fake cigarette and bolted back toward the group. Confused, I ran over to stomp out the smoldering candy stick, and that's when I saw it. Standing there, only a few yards away, was something I can only describe as a massive, hairy creature. It was towering, its fur unkempt and matted with what looked like dried blood. The smell was overpowering, like rotting meat. My legs felt weak, and I realized I had wet myself out of sheer terror. The creature didn't move at first, just stood there, watching me. I forced myself to focus and ran to grab the whistle from where it had fallen. As soon as I had it in my hands, I blew it as hard as I could. The sound echoed, and the creature let out a horrifying screech before turning and lurching back into the woods. Moments later, one of the leaders came running and scooped me up. We returned to the camp, and everyone got a serious lecture about safety and staying with the group. I'll never forget what the leader said that day. There are things out there that can harm you. It felt like a harsh thing to say to a bunch of kids, but I knew he was right. Even after that, we continued going back to the forest, but I never saw anything like it again. Years ago, during my time abroad, I stayed in Japan for educational reasons. After finishing my studies, I returned home but soon decided to go back to Japan. I loved the culture and simply felt drawn to being there. Over time, I met someone, and now we're planning to get married this autumn. Life had been smooth until an incident last week caused significant strain on our relationship. It began when an old friend contacted me via a video call. He was also from the United States but had relocated to Japan to start fresh. Being about 5 years older than me, he had already explored nearly every major attraction in the country and was raising 2 children. As we chatted casually, he suddenly brought up a place called Shizuoka Forest. Many people are likely familiar with it, but if you're not, you can look it up. I'll spare the explanation. My friend offered me $500 if I would spend 2 nights camping alone there. My fiancée, who is Japanese, strongly opposed the idea. She recounted numerous stories of people disappearing, spirits following them home, and other eerie tales. Despite her warnings, I brushed off her concerns, saying I wasn't afraid of a forest, and I accepted the bet. On the morning I left, she begged me not to go, but I was determined. Aside from proving her fears unfounded, I really wanted that $500 and a taste of adventure. After kissing her goodbye, I set out for the forest. Walking up to the edge of the forest, I felt an uneasiness. Yes, while undeniably beautiful, the place had an oppressive air. The trees were so densely packed that it felt surreal, unlike anything I'd seen before. The moment I stepped inside, I was struck by the quiet yet alive feeling of the place. I could hear wildlife, insects, birds, and distant footsteps of others exploring the forest. Strangely, the temperature dropped noticeably, and although I wouldn't admit it then, I felt a twinge of fear. Determined to go through with the bet, I followed various trails until I found a flat, secluded spot to set up camp. By then, it was about 7 p.m., and my first night began. Falling asleep was a challenge. Every rustle and unfamiliar sound made me jump. I didn't know what animals might inhabit the forest, and the place's reputation added an unsettling layer. Eventually, I dozed off, only to wake the next morning feeling exhausted. I decided to hike towards the base of a nearby mountain to pass the time and perhaps distract myself. As I walked, I took photos of trees, wildlife, and anything interesting to prove to my friend I'd been there. At some point, I put my camera away, thinking I'd taken enough pictures. That's when I heard soft crying coming from the east. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached to see if I could help. I came upon a heart-wrenching scene. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, was weeping. Beside her was an older woman, likely her mother, holding her close. They were both kneeling in front of a motionless body. It was devastating to witness. The older woman glanced at me, and for a brief moment our eyes met. Her expression was one of overwhelming sorrow, but she held back her tears. I gave her a small nod, trying to convey understanding, and walked away. I assumed the body was someone close to them, perhaps a father or brother, but I didn't want to look any closer. That image stayed with me as I continued walking, unable to shake it off. I eventually sat under a tree, reflecting on everything. My fiancée, my friend, and this foolish challenge. After much deliberation, I packed up and left the forest early. Let me explain my decision. When I entered the forest, I was focused on the thrill, the spooky reputation, the idea of defying fear. But being there made me realize it's not just a scary place. It's a site tied to immense sorrow. It's where people, feeling hopeless, come to end their lives. I hadn't considered that perspective, that for some, it's not an attraction, but a final stop. What I'd seen changed how I viewed the forest and myself. In the following months, I spiraled into depression. The reality of how fragile life is, whether by choice or circumstance, was hard to accept. I began questioning everything. Relationships, accomplishments, the point of it all. This put a strain on my relationship. My fiancé and I argued often, grew distant, and even had a physical altercation once, leading me to storm out. I ended up back at the edge of the forest, staring into it. I contemplated going in, knowing it might be my last step. The thought was both terrifying and strangely comforting. But then, I remembered the woman in the forest, the one who'd lost someone yet held herself together. She was strong, and I realized I needed to be too. I returned home, broke down, and shared everything with my fiancé. Eventually, I sought help and began taking antidepressants. They worked wonders for me. Over time, I found balance again and started reducing the dosage. It's been a year, and I feel ready to move forward. So yes, I went back to that forest. But before you ask, no, I didn't see ghosts or hear phantom voices. Maybe it's because I wasn't looking for them, or maybe they simply weren't there. The point is, if you're considering visiting such a place, ask yourself why. If it's just for a thrill, stay home. Calling it one of the scariest places is like advertising a cemetery as an amusement park attraction. I'm sharing this not to scare anyone, but to reflect. What's truly frightening isn't spirits or the supernatural, but the reality of loss and grief. I saw the pain of losing someone, something I'd been fortunate to avoid until then. It's a sobering reminder of what matters in life. If you plan to visit a place like Shizuoka Forest, think carefully about your intentions. Understand the weight of where you're going and be respectful of what it represents. I'm not entirely sure how to start this, but I guess I'll just come out with it. I saw something in the forest. It wasn't a wolf or any mythical creature people talk about. Those explanations don't add up, and you'll understand why as I go on. I was hiking along an old trail near a small town in Montana when I stumbled across a deserted campsite off the main path. Normally, I would have ignored something like that and left it for the park rangers or volunteers who maintain the trails. But this wasn't just abandoned, it was wrecked. It looked as if something violent had happened there. The tent was torn out of the ground and flipped over. Food and gear were scattered everywhere, and there were embers from a fire still burning. That last part was what made me approach. I didn't want the wind picking up and sparking a wildfire. I carefully made my way over and spent some time stomping out all the smoldering embers. Afterward, I looked around the area, calling out to see if anyone was nearby. Maybe they were in trouble. That's where I made my mistake. I'd only ventured about 30 feet into the woods when I heard it. A low, guttural growl that echoed through the trees. It didn't sound like any animal I knew. It wasn't a dog, but it wasn't a bear either. It was something else entirely. For a moment, I debated heading back to the trail, but curiosity got the better of me. If someone had been attacked or was in danger, I couldn't just leave. I continued forward, keeping an ear out for the sound, but it seemed to move unpredictably, making it hard to locate. After a while, I figured an animal must have stumbled across the campsite and gone through the belongings, searching for food. That explains some things, but not everything. Most wild animals avoid fire, yet the fire here had been disturbed, as if someone or something had kicked it apart. It was getting too eerie for me, so I decided to head back to the campsite. I didn't notice it at first, but the growling had stopped as I turned around. It wasn't until I reached the edge of the clearing that I heard it again and saw what was causing it. I froze at the tree line, hoping the creature wouldn't notice me. It was massive, towering like a bear on its hind legs, but completely hairless. That's why I knew it couldn't have been a bear. Bears don't shed all their fur, and they certainly don't walk like this thing. It moved awkwardly, lumbering around the campsite as if searching for more food. When it didn't find anything, it turned and slowly shuffled back into the forest. Once it was out of sight, I wasted no time heading back to my car and driving home. Later I tried looking up what I might have seen, but nothing matched the description. The creature was bear-sized, with round ears perched on top of its head and a long, pointed snout. Its skin was pale and smooth, and it didn't appear to have any fur or any other features like claws or even genitalia. Whatever it wasn't human. I've been hesitant to share this story because I know it sounds ridiculous, but it's been stuck in my head ever since. If anyone has an idea of what I saw, I'd really appreciate the insight. It's been driving me crazy, and I'm finally hoping someone out there can help. When I was a child, I spent a lot of time at my grandparents' house. Both my parents had jobs that required frequent travel, so I was often left in their care. It wasn't as bad as some might think. Back then, we didn't have modern internet, so there was no disappointment over missing Wi-Fi. Kids like me spent a lot of time playing outdoors, which might surprise some people today. This particular memory took place when I was about 8 years old, right around the holiday season. My grandparents let me open one present early, without my parents knowing, of course. I still remember it vividly. It was a new pair of binoculars. As a kid, I loved watching birds, a hobby I still enjoy today, though I had much more time for it back then. My grandpa looked at me and said, "You can go into the woods and look for wildlife, but don't cross the stream." Being 8, I nodded and promised, even though I didn't pay much attention to his warning. The forest behind their home was enormous, and it all belonged to him. I think my dad mentioned once that it was around 10 acres. As a kid, I liked to imagine I'd explored every inch of it, though that was far from true. That day, my imagination wasn't running wild. What I saw was real, and judging by my grandparents' reactions later, they believed me. I'd been walking through the woods for about 10 minutes, keeping as straight a path as I could while searching for animals. I spotted some cardinals and chickadees, but nothing out of the ordinary. Then I reached the stream. It was completely frozen over, but I started wondering about the other side. Why wasn't I allowed to cross? I figured it was for safety reasons. Beyond the stream, the house was no longer visible, and shouting wouldn't carry back. But in my young mind, the forbidden side seemed like the only place I'd spot something exciting. I glanced back at the house a few times, debating whether to disobey my grandpa. Just as I was about to turn back, I heard a voice. It was a man's voice, warm and kind, almost soothing, like listening to a good storyteller. It drew me in before I realized it. Without thinking, I crossed the frozen stream and wandered deeper into the woods. The voice disappeared after that, and I wasn't spotting any new birds, so I began to think I'd made a mistake. The sun was setting, and I knew I'd get in trouble if I stayed out much longer. I decided to take one last look through my binoculars before heading back. Lifting them to my eyes, I scanned the trees, doing a full circle. And then I saw him. It wasn't a bird, it was a man. He stood tall, wearing a black suit and carrying a briefcase. Through the binoculars, I guessed he was less than half a mile away. He wasn't moving, just standing there. The longer I watched, the stranger it felt. Why would someone in a suit be standing in the woods in the middle of December? My heart raced. I was so focused on the figure that I didn't hear my grandpa approaching. Before I knew it, he grabbed me and carried me back to the house, scolding me the whole way. Back home, he made me sit on the couch and asked what had made me cross the stream. Through tears, I told him I'd heard a man's voice. His expression changed completely. I remember him kneeling beside me and asking softly, "What did he say?" All he said was hello, and then I didn't hear him anymore. Grandma's face grew serious. What did he look like? He had a suit and a briefcase. I couldn't see his face. He glanced at my grandmother, then back at me. "Don't worry, kiddo. We're not angry. We were just worried." It wasn't until years later, when I was 17 and my grandpa was very sick, that I learned the truth. We were visiting him in the hospital, and when my parents stepped out to get food, he told me everything. Long ago, the land had been a cemetery, but nature had overtaken it. The man I saw was a ghost known as the mourner. According to my grandpa, he was once a businessman, hence the suit and briefcase, who'd collapsed from a heart attack during his wife's funeral. Now the legend says he roams the woods, searching for her grave. People claimed that if he caught you looking at him, you'd be cursed with illness and eventually meet the same fate, a fatal heart attack. Grandpa told me he'd been terrified that day because he knew the stories. He was relieved when I said the man's back had been to me the whole time. My grandma passed away years later, not from a heart condition, if you're curious. I still tell this story to anyone who will listen, keeping the legend alive. And whenever I visit that old house, I make sure to warn the local kids. Never cross the stream. Every small town has its own spooky tales, and mine was no different. Ours was about the woods creeper. Sure, it wasn't the most unique idea. Stories like this exist everywhere, but it had its charm. What made our version stand out was that it had a specific location tied to it. The story went something like this. Back in the 1930s, there was a man who lived near the outskirts of our town. He was convicted of several horrifying crimes involving children, kidnapping, harm, and worse. Before his execution, he vowed that he'd remain in the woods forever, preying on kids who wandered too far from their homes. To this day, parents warn their little ones, don't stray into the forest, or the woods creeper will find you. When I was younger, I bought into it, just like most of the other kids. But as I grew older, I dismissed it as just another made-up cautionary tale. After all, how could someone from the 1930s still be lurking in the woods? Still, the legend persisted. A few years ago, a boy from town went missing. He hasn't been found to this day, though one of his shoes was discovered near an abandoned drainage tunnel deep in the forest. That tunnel was only a short walk from my house and my friends, and I often used it as a secret meeting spot. We'd talk about exploring it, but never got further than peeking inside. Then, just a few weeks ago, I decided it was time to stop hesitating. I wanted to explore it once and for all. None of my friends were available that day. They all had better things to do, so I ventured out alone. It was around 6:30 p.m. when I got to the tunnel. After some effort, I managed to lift the heavy cover off and climb down the ladder. The air was damp, but the smell wasn't as bad as I remembered. I clicked on my flashlight and started walking through the tunnel. For the first 10 minutes, all I saw were a few scurrying rats. Nothing strange, nothing scary. I was just about to turn around and head back home when I heard it. A sound. Someone else was down there. I froze, listening closely. Footsteps. Then I noticed another light in the distance, faint but growing brighter as it came closer. I called out, "Hello? Is someone there?" First, there was no response. My flashlight wasn't powerful enough to fully illuminate the tunnel ahead, but I could hear the footsteps getting louder. I shouted again, "Who's there?" Then the footsteps stopped. I pointed my flashlight toward the source of the noise, and that's when I saw him. A man standing in the tunnel. His neck was twisted at an impossible angle, and the light he carried came from an old, flickering lantern. Panic surged through me. I scrambled backward and almost tripped over my own feet as I raced for the ladder. Climbing as fast as I could, I slammed the cover back into place once I was out. I sat there on the ground for a long time, staring at the tunnel entrance. My mind raced through every possible explanation. Maybe it was a prank. Someone must have known I planned to go down there, but how would they pull it off so perfectly? It would have taken hours of planning. Then there was the other possibility, a ghost. I didn't want to believe it, but everything fit. The twisted neck, the lantern, the location. It all lined up with the legend. Like I said, every town has its legends. I just never thought I'd come face to face with mine. When we were younger, we used to go on camping trips together, just a group of friends from our old scout days. We planned these excursions into the forest every now and then, and they usually went without a hitch. However, we recently encountered something that our training didn't quite prepare us for. We'd been taught to watch for wild animals, poisonous plants, and dangerous insects, but no one ever mentioned that even in the most remote woods, you might run into people. I've had a few odd experiences with strangers in the wilderness, some amusing, but there are two that stand out as unsettling. The first happened in my home state of Georgia early in February. Two friends and I reserved a primitive campsite for a weekend getaway. When we arrived, we found the site wasn't as isolated as we'd hoped. It was right off a gravel road, only a few miles from a quiet country highway. There were several campsites along the path, most of them empty. About half a mile down, there was a family that seemed like they were living their long term. Across the road from us, a lone man was camping out of his SUV. He didn't say a word while we were setting up, but we all noticed him watching us. He carried a large knife strapped to his belt, and his demeanor suggested he was a loner who avoided society, likely for his own peace of mind and everyone else's safety. On the first day, he kept his distance, though his camp wasn't far, maybe 40 feet from ours. We resigned ourselves to the fact that he'd probably be eavesdropping on us all night. Luckily, the first night passed uneventfully. The next day, he started to engage with us. When one of my friends and I were gathering firewood, he approached and pointed out a spot where we could find better wood. He was jittery, constantly fidgeting with his knife handle, and he spoke in a nervous stutter. It seemed like he wasn't used to interacting with people. Despite his strange behavior, we decided he wasn't a threat. We outnumbered him 3-1, and his oddities made him more of an amusing neighbor for the weekend than anything else. That evening, things took a turn. A single car pulled into the campsite next to his, soon followed by another, and then another. In the end, 5 vehicles showed up, bringing a large group of city folks who took over 3 campsites. The man's irritation was immediately obvious. His previous glances at us paled in comparison to the intense stare he directed at them. It got worse when one of the newcomers let their dog roam off leash. Within minutes, the dog bounded over to the man's campsite, wagging its tail and jumping on him. The man froze, visibly restraining himself from reacting violently. He barked at the dog, a guttural, animalistic sound, until the owner came over to retrieve it. The man's response was chilling. "Next time that mutt comes over here, I'll put it down." The group seemed unfazed, but they kept the dog leashed after that. As night fell, they became even more intrusive, their loud conversations and barking dog echoing through the woods. We whispered jokes about them, mimicking their exaggerated city slicker attitudes, and eventually went to bed, though the noise made it hard to sleep. At dawn, I woke up cold and saw my friend crouched by the fire pit, trying to reignite the embers. I shut my eyes again, but soon heard voices. One of them was the man's. He stood over my friend, hand resting on his knife handle as always. I pretended to sleep, listening. "Which one of you was doing that dumb voice last night?" he asked. My friend hesitated before admitting, "That was me." The man laughed awkwardly. "Man, you guys had me laughing in my tent. I was this close," he said, holding his fingers an inch apart. "If y'all hadn't cracked me up, I was about 10 seconds from grabbing my gun and making them shut up." My friend nervously chuckled, but the tension was palpable. The man continued ranting about how he hated city people invading the woods, asking if we were from a nearby metropolis. My friend lied, saying we were locals. Satisfied, the man eventually wandered back to his camp. As soon as he was out of earshot, my friend turned to me, wide-eyed. "Did you hear that?" "Yeah, thank God we're leaving today," I replied. We packed up quickly and left hours ahead of schedule. As we drove away, one of us joked about hearing on the news that someone had gone on a rampage at that campsite, but it didn't feel funny at the time. In hindsight, humor was our best defense against an unpredictable situation. That wasn't the last time we encountered strange hermits in the woods, but it was one of the most unnerving. The second time I ran into someone unexpectedly in the forest could have gone much worse. I was on a camping trip with the same 2 friends from my last outing, but this time there was a 4th person with us, a buddy who wasn't an experienced camper but was still good company. This trip was a more ambitious one. We drove down to Georgia for a 5-day, 4-night adventure, setting up at a remote campsite far from any towns. After driving several miles on a bumpy dirt road, we reached a circular clearing where we parked our vehicles. From there, we hiked downhill to our camp, which was located on a higher bank of a quiet stream. I can't remember the exact time of year, but it was hot and dry, with the stream being ankle-deep in most spots, except for a few deeper pools. The landscape was lush, the terrain hilly, and the vegetation wildly different from what we were used to. That made it all the more exciting. We brought fishing gear along, hoping to explore the stream and test our luck. However, as someone new to fishing, I was struggling compared to my friends. The trip was enjoyable overall, but by the 3rd day, the tension of spending so much time together started to show. That's when someone suggested driving across the state line into Tennessee to visit a spot called Sliding Rock. It wasn't a bad idea, but I wasn't particularly interested. The others were eager to go, and that's when we made a rookie mistake. In outdoor safety, you're always told to follow the buddy system, never venture into the wilderness alone. But since nothing dangerous had happened in the first couple of days, we decided that they'd head off on their little side trip while I stayed behind to watch the camp. In hindsight, staying alone with a dying phone wasn't the smartest idea. They left me the keys to the spare car, just in case. Honestly, though, I found the solitude refreshing. I cooked some grits over the fire for lunch, read a book for a bit, and then cleaned the pot in the stream. That's when I caught my very first fish, a small catfish that had come to nibble on my leftover grits. Feeling lucky, I snapped a photo and sent it to my friends before releasing the catfish back into the water. I then wandered downstream to try my luck again, eventually catching a baby bass in a rocky section of the stream. After releasing the fish, I took a break on a rock in the gentle current. While enjoying the peaceful surroundings, a strange unease crept over me. Suddenly, I heard a snap in the steep forest beside the stream. I jumped up, scanning for movement, but saw nothing. Looking down, I realized my legs were covered in tiny leeches. Panicking, I ripped them off as quickly as I could. When I was sure they were gone, I headed back to camp. Along the way, I accidentally stepped on a sharp root, bruising my foot, which made me even more nervous about being out there alone. Back at camp, I stripped down to check for any leftover leeches using the camp's small mirror. After making sure I was clear, I got dressed, settled into my hammock with a beer, and waited for the others to return. When they got back, we shared stories of what we'd done while apart. Soon, it was decided that I'd join one of the others to go charge our phones in the car. We were gone for about an hour, but when we returned, there he was. A man stood in the stream near our camp, talking to our two friends. His clothes and gear made it clear he lived out of his backpack, an old-school survivalist type. His name, they told me later, was Roy. Roy claimed to own the surrounding woods, granting us permission to stay as long as we were respectful. What really unnerved me, though, was when he mentioned seeing me earlier by the stream. Apparently, he'd been watching me the whole time, maybe even when I'd stripped to check for leeches. His presence was unsettling. While he didn't outright threaten us, his slow, deliberate movements and cryptic words kept us on edge. My friend said he'd inched closer to the camp until we returned, which might have been his signal to back off. Eventually, Roy wandered off, but for the rest of the trip, we couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there. We took turns keeping watch at night, staying alert for any sign of him. Thankfully, he never came back. But every sound in the dark, the snap of a branch or the call of an owl, kept our nerves on high alert. I had taken a long break from going camping, but I recently decided to head out on my first trip in years. There were 4 of us in total. I invited a couple of friends who had camped with me before, and one of them brought along their new partner. I reserved a spot at a campsite I used to visit, but things had changed a lot since my last time there. The trees were fuller, the bushes were thicker, and the overall plant life was more vibrant and abundant. Trails that once wound through the woods were now completely overgrown. It seemed like the area had been left untouched for a few years, possibly due to the lockdowns, and nature had reclaimed it. Unfortunately, my companions didn't seem to appreciate the wild beauty as much as I did. In the past, we all shared an understanding of respecting the outdoors, but this time, they behaved differently. I couldn't entirely blame them. It had been a tough few years, and everyone needed a chance to unwind. Still, it's important to remember that when you're in the wilderness, you're a visitor in nature's domain. As soon as we settled in, my friends started acting like they were at a rowdy college party. They were snapping branches off trees, saying they were in the way, drinking way too much, and tossing empty cans into the forest. They even spread hot embers from the fire pit around the campsite, letting them catch fire before stomping them out at the last second. They were breaking every unspoken rule of camping. I got frustrated and told them to stop, but they just laughed it off, handed me a drink, and told me to relax. I tried to enjoy myself, but as the evening dragged on, so did my patience. While they stayed up, loudly shouting and laughing, I decided to head to bed early. I lay in my tent, unable to sleep. They were still yelling and being obnoxiously loud, which only added to my irritation. Eventually, late into the night, they quieted down, and it felt like the forest finally exhaled. I stayed awake for a while, listening to the insects buzzing outside. After some time, I got up to use the bathroom. I stepped outside my tent and wandered to the edge of the trees. As I stood there, gazing into the darkness, my eyes adjusted. I could see the crescent moon shining through the canopy. Then, something caught my attention. 2 eyes glimmered in the darkness, staring straight at me. They glowed faintly in the dim light, and I froze in surprise, instinctively turning away for just a moment. When I looked back, the eyes were closer. In the moonlight, I could make out the shape of a person, or at least something that looked like one. They stood unnaturally still, their presence deeply unsettling. I forced myself to speak. "Who's there?" My voice cracked slightly, but there was no answer. I stumbled in my pocket for the small flashlight I had brought. Looking down for just a second to click it on, I pointed it toward the figure. They had moved again, now only about 30 feet away. My heart raced as the light revealed more details. To my shock, the figure looked exactly like my friend's partner, wearing the same clothes I had seen them in earlier. But their eyes were unnaturally pale, almost glowing, and their posture was off, as if they were being held up by invisible strings. "Emily?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "What are you doing out here?" There was a long pause, and then they spoke, but it wasn't Emily's voice. It was mine. "What are you doing out here?" They repeated, mimicking me perfectly. A chill ran through me as I stepped back. They mirrored my movement, gliding forward in a way that was unnervingly smooth. My mind raced. Was she unwell, or was I looking at something else entirely? "Emily, it's late," I said cautiously. "You should be in your tent. Are you feeling okay?" Again, they repeated my words exactly, in my voice. "You should be in your tent." I was overcome with fear and backed away, keeping my flashlight trained on them. They continued to follow, matching my movement step for step. I retreated toward the tents and banged on the one belonging to my friend and Emily. "Chris, get up," I shouted. "Something's wrong with Emily." Chris groaned as he unzipped the tent flap. "What are you yelling about?" he asked, clearly annoyed. He pulled the flap open wider, revealing Emily, fast asleep in her sleeping bag. "What?" I stammered. "But she's right there." I spun around and pointed my flashlight where I'd just seen her. But the figure was gone, vanished without a trace. Chris dismissed my panic, telling me I was imagining things, and went back to sleep. I couldn't relax after that. I sat by the fire, poking at the embers and keeping watch for the rest of the night. Every sound from the forest made my heart pound, expecting to see those pale eyes appear again. At dawn, I'd had enough. I woke everyone and insisted we pack up and leave. They were annoyed and tried to convince me I was overreacting. But since I'd driven and brought much of the gear, they didn't have a choice. The ride home was silent, and my friends haven't spoken to me much since. They think I need help, but I know what I saw. Maybe something out there got used to people being gone for a while, and we didn't exactly leave a good impression. Whatever it was, I don't think I'll be going camping again anytime soon. Christmas morning in Memphis was meant to be serene. I had been looking forward to a slow start, sipping hot tea while the rest of the city slept off the excitement of Christmas Eve. Living near the heart of downtown had its perks. Beale Street, with its music clubs and glowing signs, was just a short walk away. But mornings were typically quiet. At least they were until chaos struck. I woke up around 5:15 a.m., startled by an unfamiliar sound. It wasn't the usual hum of the city. It was a rapid succession of sharp pops, almost like gunshots echoing down the street. At first, I figured someone had celebrated too hard and was setting off leftover fireworks. But there was something unsettling about it. It was sharper, louder, and more deliberate. Curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a jacket and stepped onto the balcony of my third-floor apartment overlooking River Street. The street below was eerily still, the crisp morning air carrying an unsettling silence. That's when I noticed it, a large, worn-out camper van parked in the middle of the road, directly in front of a regional telecom office. The van seemed out of place, an old model that looked like it hadn't moved in years. It was not the sort of vehicle you'd expect downtown, particularly on Christmas morning. But what grabbed my attention even more was the sound emanating from it. A pre-recorded voice echoed down the street, calm yet robotic, repeating the same warning. Asterisk, evacuate this area immediately. Evacuate this area immediately. Asterisk, I froze, my breath visible in the cold. It felt surreal, like something straight out of a suspense movie. A warning on Christmas morning? As I glanced around, I noticed a few neighbors stepping onto their balconies or peering from their windows, their expressions just as confused as mine. One man ventured into the street, shouting toward the camper, but the voice kept looping, unaffected. Then the message changed. The voice announced, asterisk, this vehicle will detonate in 15 minutes. This vehicle will detonate in 15 minutes. Asterisk, my stomach dropped. This wasn't a prank. It wasn't a strange holiday stunt. It was real. I grabbed my phone to call emergency services, but the lines were overwhelmed. Sirens blared in the distance, growing louder by the second. Panic set in. I ran back inside, shaking my roommate awake and shouting that we needed to leave. Groggy and confused, she stared at me for a moment, but the urgency in my voice spurred her into action. She grabbed her jacket while I snatched my keys, and we bolted down the stairs and out the back door, joining a small crowd of others gathering in an alley behind our building. By then, police officers had arrived. Their flashing lights illuminated the dark morning as they yelled for everyone to move farther back. I saw one officer sprinting door to door, pounding on them and urging residents to evacuate. The robotic voice continued its unnerving countdown, calm and detached amidst the growing chaos. Asterisk, 10 minutes. Asterisk, we had made it several blocks away when it happened. At exactly 6:30 a.m., the camper exploded. The blast was deafening, a thunderous roar that shook the ground and sent shockwaves through the air. Instinctively, I ducked, shielding my head as a fiery mushroom cloud rose into the sky. A moment later, the shockwave hit, rattling windows and setting off car alarms in every direction. When I looked up, a thick column of black smoke twisted into the sky. Debris rained down, and the acrid smell of burning metal and chemicals filled the air. Around me, the crowd stood in stunned silence. Some people cried while others clutched their phones, frantically calling loved ones. A man near me kept muttering, "Oh my God," his hands trembling. I turned back toward River Street. Even from a distance, the destruction was visible. The explosion had carved out a massive crater where the camper had been, leaving nearby buildings heavily damaged. Windows were shattered, and storefronts were on fire. Smoke poured from the rubble, and flames flickered amid the debris. What struck me most was the emptiness of the street. If not for the warning, the loss of life would have been unimaginable. It was Christmas morning, a time when the city was usually still, but on any other day, this part of downtown would have been bustling. Emergency crews arrived within minutes. Firefighters battled the flames while police officers secured the area, taping off streets and pushing back onlookers. Even with their swift response, the devastation was overwhelming. As the hours passed, the grim details began to emerge. This had been a deliberate act, a bombing. Investigators believed the telecom office had been the target, as the blast caused widespread disruptions to phone and internet services across the region. The man responsible, a local resident named Daniel Quinn Turner, had been inside the camper when it detonated. The FBI identified him quickly using DNA evidence from the scene. His meticulous planning, including the evacuation message, had undoubtedly saved lives. But the reasons behind his actions, why he chose Christmas, why he targeted Memphis, remained unclear. In the days that followed, the city felt different. River Street, usually alive with music and laughter, was cordoned off, a haunting reminder of that morning. News crews filled the area, filming the wreckage. Locals left flowers and messages at the barricades, small signs of resilience amid the tragedy. I think about that day often. We came so close to a far worse disaster. The bomber's warning gave people a chance to escape, but the psychological toll lingers. Even now, a loud noise downtown makes me flinch, my mind snapping back to that moment. The explosion, the smoke, the chaos. Christmas will never feel the same again. That day was a harsh reminder of how fragile life can be, how quickly everything can change. But it was also a testament to the strength of a city and its people, coming together in the face of unimaginable events. By Christmas of 1976, the heat was oppressive along the northern shores of Australia. I was 30 years old then, a mother of 2 young children, Emma and Luke, ages 5 and 3. As Christmas Eve approached, both kids were brimming with excitement for Santa's arrival. My day had been jam-packed with last-minute preparations, though I couldn't shake an uneasy feeling from the news trickling in about a potential cyclone. Cyclone warnings were not uncommon, but at that time of year, they rarely caused concern. Most either fizzled out or changed course before doing real harm. Still, as the sun set that evening, the heavy stillness in the air was unnerving. though we brushed it off as we gathered with neighbors to celebrate. The kids, dressed in their festive pajamas, played while the adults sipped drinks, chatting under the twinkle of Christmas lights. By midnight, the winds had picked up, rattling the windows and bending trees. My husband Mark turned on the radio to check updates. The reports were worrying, but no one fully understood how serious the situation was. By 2 a.m., the storm's strength had increased dramatically. The wind screamed like a living thing, and rain lashed our home relentlessly. We brought the children into our bedroom, thinking it would be safer. The power cut out shortly after, plunging us into pitch-black darkness. Only flashes of lightning lit up the chaos outside, branches flying, trees swaying violently, and debris whipping through the air. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash as the living room window shattered. Glass scattered across the floor and the wind tore through the house, ripping curtains off their rods and sending furniture tumbling. Mark yelled, "Get to the bathroom," and we scrambled to grab the children. The bathroom was cramped, but it felt like the safest spot. Mark wedged a mattress against the door to block out the wind. I clutched Emma and Luke, whispering reassurances I could barely believe myself. The house shuddered violently, and it felt as if the walls might collapse at any moment. Then, as abruptly as it started, the storm stopped. A heavy silence settled over us. "We're in the eye," Mark said after peeking out. "We need to check on the neighbors while we can." Despite my protests, he ventured outside. The devastation was staggering. Entire homes reduced to rubble, streets buried under debris, cars overturned, and trees uprooted. Some neighbors wandered aimlessly, their faces pale and streaked with blood, while others called out desperately for missing loved ones. Mark returned quickly, urging us to stay put as the second half of the storm was imminent. When it hit, the winds came from the opposite direction, fiercer than before, as though the cyclone was determined to finish what it had started. Rain poured in through cracks and gaps, soaking us to the bone. The bathroom door buckled under the relentless force, and the roof peeled away in sheets of metal. I clung to Emma and Luke, shielding them as best I could. The noise was indescribable, a relentless cacophony of crashing wood, screeching metal, and the terrifying roar of the wind. The pressure in my ears built up, and I felt the vibrations of the storm deep in my chest. Time blurred into an eternity of fear. Finally, as dawn broke, the wind subsided. Emerging from the bathroom, we were confronted with utter devastation. Our house was barely standing. The roof was gone, and most of the walls had caved in. The kitchen was a wreck, buried under debris. Outside, the scene was even worse. Entire streets were unrecognizable, power lines dangled dangerously, and fragments of lives were strewn everywhere. Clothes, toys, and even photographs scattered in the mud. Darwin, or what was left of it, looked like a battlefield. Neighbors helped each other dig through the rubble, hoping to find survivors. Miraculously, our family was unharmed, but the same couldn't be said for many others. Over 60 people lost their lives that night, with countless more injured or left homeless by what would later be called Cyclone Tilda. In the days that followed, the extent of the destruction became clearer. Cyclone Tilda had obliterated nearly 75% of Darwin, leaving tens of thousands without shelter. The government declared a state of emergency and began evacuating residents. We were among those flown out, taking only what little we could carry. Saying goodbye to the place we had called home was heartbreaking. Rebuilding Darwin was a monumental task that many said would take years. Yet, through the heartbreak and loss, the community spirit never faltered. Strangers shared food, water, and comfort. People leaned on each other, finding strength in solidarity. Even now, decades later, the sound of strong winds still sets my heart racing, and the smell of rain takes me back to that terrifying night. But I also remember the kindness, resilience, and bravery that followed. Cyclone Tilda was a devastating force, but it revealed the best in people. Today, Darwin stands stronger than ever, a thriving city rebuilt to withstand nature's fury. For those of us who lived through it, though, that night isn't just history. It's a part of who we are. I share this story not to dwell on the fear, but to honor the strength of those who survived and the memory of those we lost. It was supposed to be a joyful afternoon, only a couple of days before Christmas. The streets were bustling with last-minute shoppers, and I had finished work earlier than usual. I decided to head downtown for a coffee and to watch the ice skaters at the rink in the heart of the city before heading home. This square, especially during the holidays, felt like the heartbeat of the town, a place filled with families, couples, and groups of friends bundled up against the cold. The air carried the scent of roasted chestnuts and mulled wine from nearby stalls. As I walked, soaking up the festive energy, I couldn't help but reflect on how magical this time of year could be. Turning onto Elm Street, I moved toward the square, enjoying the holiday atmosphere. That's when it happened. Looking back, I think I noticed the garbage truck before most people did. It felt out of place, lumbering along in a way that didn't match the usual flow of traffic. Something about its motion seemed wrong, swaying slightly and ignoring the stop-and-go rhythm of city traffic. At first, I thought the driver was simply in a hurry, eager to finish work and start his holiday break. But then the truck swerved. It jumped the curb and climbed onto the sidewalk. That's when chaos erupted. The massive green vehicle tore through the crowd on Elm Street, giving people almost no time to react. Some froze in shock, while others tried to run, dragging their children along. The truck was moving too fast and in too erratic a manner for anyone to predict where it would go next. It was unstoppable. I remember hearing a woman scream. My head turned toward her briefly before my eyes locked back on the truck. Horror gripped me as I saw it smash into a bench, then plow through several trash bins, scattering debris everywhere. Glass shattered as it clipped a storefront window, and the metallic screech of the collision was deafening. Panic spread like wildfire. People screamed warnings, urging others to move out of the truck's path. I saw a young man grab an elderly woman just in time, pulling her out of harm's way as the truck missed them by inches. Others weren't so lucky. The truck barreled into a group of people, and the image of their bodies being flung like bowling pins is something I'll never forget. Some were struck so hard their shoes were left behind. Cries filled the air as people shouted at the driver to stop, but it seemed as though he couldn't hear us or couldn't respond. The truck sped down Elm Street and turned into the square. My feet moved instinctively, carrying me toward the commotion. I had to see what was happening, though I felt powerless to do anything. When I reached the square, it was like stepping into a nightmare. What should have been a scene of joy, fairy lights twinkling, a giant Christmas tree towering in the center, had turned into chaos. The truck had crashed into a building and finally stopped, but not before leaving devastation in its wake. An overturned stroller lay near the holiday market stalls. A man knelt beside it, checking on the crying baby inside. A pang of relief hit me. The child was alive. Around them, people lay motionless on the ground, while others knelt to perform CPR or frantically called emergency services. I stood frozen, unable to fully process the horror around me. A man nearby muttered, "It looks like a battlefield." All I could do was nod in silent agreement. The air was filled with an awful mix of groans, screams, and the wail of approaching sirens. Later, I learned that the driver had suffered a medical emergency, either a heart attack or a sudden blackout, causing him to lose control of the truck. At the time, no one knew the cause, and the uncertainty only made the situation more horrifying. I'll never forget the sight of a woman sitting on the ground, cradling another in her arms. The woman she held wasn't moving. Her face was pale, lips slightly parted as if she were about to speak. The first woman, maybe a friend or sister, rocked gently, whispering, "You'll be okay," though her expression betrayed her fear. The police arrived quickly, cordoning off the area and ushering the uninjured away. Their faces mirrored our shock, as did the paramedics as they flooded the square and began loading people onto stretchers. I felt like staying would be wrong. I wasn't helping by being there, so I stepped back and stood beneath the massive Christmas tree, trying to collect myself. In the days that followed, the details came out bit by bit. 7 people lost their lives, and many more were left with life-altering injuries. The entire town was shaken. Tributes poured in for the victims, with flowers and heartfelt messages filling the square. A vigil brought people together, survivors, witnesses, and others who came to pay their respects. For weeks, I couldn't stop replaying what I had seen. I kept thinking about the young couple I'd noticed earlier, laughing as they strolled hand in hand. Were they okay? Had they made it out unharmed? What about the woman with the stroller? Even now, years later, I avoid the square during Christmas time if I can help it. The town showed its resilience, coming together as it always does, but the scars remain. For those of us who were there, December 19th will never feel like just another day. It was the evening of December 24th, 1955. The night was unusually mild and calm, with a subtle anticipation in the air. My sister, Anna, and I boarded the northbound express from Wellington to Hamilton, eager to spend Christmas with our family. Anna, just 17, was brimming with energy, her laughter lifting the spirits of the crowded train. I was 22, having recently started a new job in Dunedin, and this journey was a rare opportunity to reconnect. The train was alive with the sounds of families, couples, and solo travelers heading home for the holidays. Our carriage was filled with conversation and the rustle of parcels, wrapped gifts stacked carefully beside seats. I still remember the steady rhythm of the train wheels against the tracks, a soothing melody that matched the festive mood inside the carriage. Hours passed, and the lively chatter gave way to quiet murmurs as passengers relaxed. Anna and I, lulled by the train's motion, dozed in our seats. The moment when everything changed is still vivid. Near midnight, I was startled awake by a strange sensation. The train, which had been gliding smoothly, began to jolt and sway unnaturally. At first, I thought it might be a sharp bend in the tracks, but the jerking grew more violent and the carriage pitched sideways. Suddenly, there was an ear-splitting roar, as though the earth had split apart. The lights flickered briefly before plunging us into total darkness. Shouts and screams filled the air. Anna's hand gripped mine tightly, her voice trembling with fear as she asked, "What's going on?" I had no answer. The train came to a grinding halt, not the controlled stop we expected, but with a horrifying sensation of falling. The carriage tilted sharply, throwing people and luggage into a chaotic heap. The sound of breaking glass and splintering would echoed as we plummeted into freezing water below. I can't recall the exact moment the train struck the river, but the impact felt like being hit by an enormous force. Water surged into the carriage, icy and unforgiving, rising swiftly and engulfing everything. The cries of passengers turned into gasps and frantic shouts for help as the freezing current overwhelmed us. I called out for Anna, but my voice was lost in the chaos. Her hand slipped from mine as the water surged between us, and panic overtook me as I struggled to stay above the surface. The overturned carriage was like a tomb, cold, dark, and quickly running out of air. Somehow I found an opening, a shattered window or broken door, and clawed my way into the rushing river. The icy water numbed my limbs, but I forced myself to swim toward what I hoped was the riverbank. Around me, other survivors called out for help, their voices blending with the roar of the river. When I finally crawled onto the muddy shore, shivering and exhausted, I looked back at the wreckage. The sight was horrifying. The Greystone River, swollen by volcanic debris and water rushing down from Mount Taranga's crater lake, had torn apart the bridge just moments before the train arrived. Most of the train carriages were submerged or swept away, trapping the people inside. Desperately, I searched for Anna, calling her name until my voice gave out. Other survivors were doing the same. Some waded into the water to help, while others stood in shock, sobbing. Local residents, drawn by the commotion, arrived to assist, pulling the injured to safety. The night was filled with cries, frantic shouting, and the unrelenting roar of the river. As dawn broke, the full extent of the disaster became clear. Bodies were retrieved from the wreckage and laid on the muddy banks. The holiday gifts, once a symbol of joy, were scattered across the river, their bright wrapping paper a stark contrast to the grim scene. The air was heavy with the smell of mud and smoke, and the cries of survivors echoed in the still morning. Later that day, I found Anna. Her body was caught in debris downstream. She looked serene, as though she were just sleeping, but the sight shattered me in ways I can't explain. I sat beside her, holding her cold hand, whispering apologies for not saving her. In the days that followed, the Tarina Bridge disaster dominated the news. We learned that a sudden volcanic mudflow had destroyed the bridge supports just minutes before the train arrived. The train had no warning and couldn't stop in time. Of the 275 passengers on board, 145 lost their lives. Even now, I wonder why I survived when so many didn't. The memories of that night linger. The roar of the river, the cries for help, and the image of my sister's lifeless body. But I also remember the courage of the locals who risked their lives to help strangers, and the determination of the survivors who refused to give up. The Torina disaster changed my life forever. It took my sister, fractured my family, and left scars that will never fully heal. Yet, it also taught me the irreplaceable value of time spent with loved ones. It was Christmas Eve in Aspen, Wisconsin, and though life was tough, there was a sense of anticipation in the air. For the lumberjacks and their families, the holiday celebration at the finish hall was a rare chance to forget their daily struggles, even if just for a short while. The strike had been ongoing for months, and tensions with the timber companies were high. Most of the men hadn't worked in weeks, and money was scarce. The Women's Auxiliary of the Workers' Union had worked tirelessly to arrange the event, determined to bring some joy to the children, despite the hardship. I arrived early with my cousin Emily and her two little ones, Clara and Henry. Clara, who was 4, held tightly to her mother's hand. Her wide eyes lit up as she saw the Christmas tree in the hall, a towering, glittering wonder standing proudly in the corner of the large upstairs space where the party was being held. Laughter from the children filled the room, blending with cheerful conversations, and the soft melodies of carols played on a small upright piano. The hall was packed, the wooden floor creaking under the weight of so many people. Families were bundled up in heavy coats and scarves, their cheeks rosy from the cold. Volunteers passed out small gifts, tin figurines, cloth dolls, and candies wrapped in bright paper. For many of these children, it was the only gift they would receive that year. I watched Clara and Henry join the other children by the tree, their faces glowing with happiness as they danced and played. I stood near the back with Emily, warming my hands with a cup of steaming coffee, the scent of pine mixed with the aroma of damp wool and faint hints of food from the kitchen downstairs. And then it happened. A sharp, urgent voice cut through the music and chatter. Fire! Fire! For a moment, everything froze. The music stopped and the crowd went silent. Then, like a spark in dry leaves, panic spread. People screamed, and the room erupted as everyone surged toward the single staircase leading to the street below. The only way out. Emily grabbed my arm, her face pale with fear, and we pushed forward through the frantic crowd. People shouted and shoved, their faces contorted with terror. I tried to stay calm, telling myself there was no smoke, no heat, no sign of fire, but the fear was real and contagious. Clara and Henry had been near the tree when the chaos began. By the time we reached them, they were crying and clutching each other tightly. Emily scooped Clara into her arms, and I took Henry's hand, pulling him close as we turned toward the exit. The stairs were a bottleneck, a crush of bodies pressing into the narrow space. From where I stood, I could see people falling, tripping, and being trampled. The screams were deafening, a terrible symphony of desperation. I clung to Henry's hand, terrified of losing him. Emily was just ahead, clutching Clara, her face streaked with tears. Step by agonizing step, we moved forward. The air grew thick, not with smoke hung, but with panic and the oppressive heat of so many people crammed together. Somewhere in the chaos, a voice yelled, "There's no fire. It's a false alarm," but it was too late. Fear had taken over, unstoppable and deadly. It felt like hours before we reached the bottom of the stairs, though it was likely only minutes. When we finally stumbled out into the freezing night air, my legs were trembling, and Henry was sobbing so hard he could barely breathe. Emily clutched Clara tightly, her face pale and tears streaked. Outside, the street was chaos. People shouted names, searching for loved ones. Others stood in shock, staring at the hall's entrance, where bodies were still wedged together, a horrifying barricade that had blocked the exit. Cries of anguish echoed from those still trapped inside. We didn't learn the truth until later. There had been no fire, no danger. Someone, a cruel soul, perhaps tied to the timber companies, had shouted fire to incite panic, knowing the havoc it would unleash. The narrow stairway had become a death trap, and by the end of the night, 67 people were dead, most of them children. The days that followed were filled with unbearable grief. One funeral followed another in an endless procession of small caskets. The community was shattered, our hearts broken by the senselessness of it all. I think of that night often, of the children's faces, their laughter silenced forever. I think of the cruel act that caused such devastation and the lives it ruined. And I think of Clara and Henry, how close we came to losing them, and how fragile life can be. The Finnish hall is gone now, torn down years later. In its place stands a simple marker, a solemn reminder of that terrible night. Every Christmas Eve I light a candle for those we lost, holding my loved ones close, grateful for the time we have together. For celebration, prayer, and being with loved ones, we had planned a simple day in our small village of M. We would attend the chapel, share a meal, and honor the birth of Jesus. But instead, it became the day everything changed, the day our world was shattered. Even now, when I think of that day, the memory is stained by the sharp smell of burning, as if the air itself sought to smother our hope. Before the sun rose, I was helping my mother prepare cassava and beans for the Christmas meal. My younger brother, Zama, who had just turned 7, was outside playing with our father, passing his new football back and forth. Zama was overjoyed, not just because it was a gift, but because he could now play with his friends. Our father laughed and said Zama would one day be a great footballer, travel far away, and earn enough money to change our lives. We all laughed, unaware of the nightmare inching closer. The first warning came as a distant rumble, much like thunder, though the sky was clear and blue. We thought it might be cattle herds or a strong wind in the trees. Then we heard it, a crackling sound that could only be gunfire. That's when we knew something was terribly wrong. They arrived like a storm. The attackers, a group of 20 or 30 young men, all with hardened eyes and streaks of paint smeared across their faces. Some carried rifles, others machetes or clubs embedded with metal and nails. Their wild cries echoed in a language I didn't understand, but their intent was unmistakable. They came to kill, to destroy, to torment. We ran, but where could we go? The village was surrounded by dense forest, and the attackers moved swiftly. Grabbing Zama's hand, I dragged him toward the chapel, thinking it would be a place of safety. But as we approached the steps, the sight stopped me cold. Bodies lay scattered, men, women, children. The attackers had shown no mercy. I gripped Zama's hand tighter, my heart pounding as he asked innocently, "Sister, what's happening?" I had no words for him, no way to explain the horror. We saw one of our uncles step forward, his hands raised as he begged for mercy. A gunshot silenced him, and the attackers laughed. It was a sound I will never forget. The survivors were gathered in the dirt. A man who seemed to be their leader barked orders, and the attackers split us into groups, men from women, adults from children. My father was among the men. He gave me one final look, his eyes filled with love and fear before they led him away. I never saw him again. The rest of us, mostly women and children, were forced into the chapel. The attackers turned it into a place of slaughter. They set it ablaze and made us watch as the flames devoured what should have been our sanctuary. Anyone who tried to escape was cut down or shot. I held Zama tightly, shielding him as best I could, but how could I protect him? The attackers moved among us like predators, laughing as they inflicted unspeakable pain. One man noticed us. He had a machete in his hand and a twisted grin on his face. He grabbed Zama, yanking him from my arms. I screamed, begged, and pleaded, but he struck me with the butt of his rifle, and everything went blurry. The last thing I heard before darkness took me was Zama's terrified cries. When I woke, the village was silent except for the crackling of fire and the faint cries of the injured. The attackers were gone, leaving behind only death and destruction. I stumbled through the village, calling for Zama, for my mother, for anyone. The only responses were the moans of the dying. The chapel was a blackened shell. Its remains standing as a cruel monument to the massacre. Bodies lay everywhere, many unrecognizable. I found my mother among them, her lifeless eyes staring at the sky. I collapsed beside her, sobbing, but Zama was nowhere. I searched for days, combing through the forests and nearby villages, but he had vanished. I can only hope he's alive somewhere, though in my heart I fear the worst. The attackers were known to abduct children, forcing them into slavery or turning them into soldiers, a fate worse than death. Years have passed since that Christmas, but the wounds remain. I still see the faces of the dead in my dreams, hear their cries, smell the smoke, and feel the heat of the flames. I wonder why no one came to help us, why the world turned away. For a while, the world seemed to notice the terror inflicted by these groups, especially in campaigns like the one in 2012. But now the world has moved on. We remain forgotten. I share this story not to seek pity, but to ensure these memories are not erased. I want the world to remember the lives lost, the families broken. I want justice for my village, for my family, for Zama, and for all the others who suffered and continue to suffer. First, in early December, we welcomed her side of the family for a pre-holiday get-together. Since we had spent the previous Christmas with them, we decided to enjoy this year in our own home while still sharing some holiday cheer. Her parents, siblings, cousins, and their kids all came over that weekend, arriving with gifts for our son, who was still the youngest in the family. Most of his cousins were well into their elementary school years by then, so he remained the baby of the group, and, as you can imagine, they doted on him endlessly. When they left, the pile of gifts under our tree had grown significantly, with most of them addressed to our little boy. The following weekend, we hosted some of our old friends from college. My wife and I had met during our years at Texas A&M, and we shared a close-knit circle of friends from that time. 7 of them came over, bringing both holiday cheer and more presents. Like my wife's family, they seemed determined to make the holidays magical for our son. Watching the growing mountain of wrapped gifts under our tree felt almost surreal. It was like something out of a Christmas postcard, right there in our living room. For me, it was especially meaningful because my childhood memories of Christmas were far from happy. I remembered a handful of joyful Christmases with my mom, dad, and younger sister when I was little, but that all changed in 1995 when I was 7 years old. My sister passed away in a devastating incident, and everything was different after that. Christmas turned into a time of deep sorrow, especially for my mom, who coped by drinking heavily. My dad stood by her, but the pain was too much, and our family was never the same. When my mother passed away due to her declining health, my father's grief overwhelmed him. He died of a heart attack 4 years later, leaving me an orphan at 16. I moved in with my aunt, throwing myself into schoolwork as an escape. It wasn't until my senior year of college that I began to feel anything resembling normal again. By then, I was dating my wife, but it wasn't until we were engaged that I opened up about my past. The loss of my sister, my mother's struggles, and my father's untimely death. She accepted me wholeheartedly, and from that moment, I knew I'd made the right choice in marrying her. She understood better than anyone how painful Christmas had been for me, and worked to create new, joyful traditions filled with light, laughter, and love. Seeing all those gifts under our tree that year wasn't just about generosity, it was healing. Throughout December, we hosted other gatherings, from family friends we hadn't seen in a while to our colleagues. Neighbors stopped by with cookies and small gifts, welcoming us warmly to the neighborhood. By the time Christmas Eve arrived, the stack of presents under the tree had grown into a sprawling collection of colorful packages, most of them for our son. As we put him to bed that night, my wife and I shared a quiet moment of gratitude for how far we'd come. Among all the gifts, there was one small box addressed to me. The wrapping was plain and unassuming, a mustard yellow, and the tag bore only my name with no indication of who had sent it. When I finally opened it on Christmas morning, my heart sank. Inside was an old, grimy doll, one that I recognized instantly. It had belonged to my sister. I froze, staring at it in disbelief. My wife later told me she thought I'd unwrapped an expensive tie at first because of my expression. But when she tried to get a closer look, I stopped her, whispering no over and over. The doll was a Barbie with a short haircut, the same haircut my sister had given it before she died. 30 years earlier, my sister had taken that doll to the park where she was abducted. When her body was found, the doll was missing. The police suspected her killer had kept it as a twisted trophy. After finding the doll under our tree, I contacted the police immediately. Forensic analysis confirmed it was indeed the same doll, still bearing soil from the park where my sister's body had been discovered. Whoever had placed it under our tree had preserved it carefully for decades. The implications were chilling. My sister's murderer had been in our home, posing as a friendly guest. The revelation shattered me. I became consumed with paranoia, unable to trust anyone. Eventually, I checked myself into a psychiatric facility, where I began the slow process of healing. 6 months later, we moved out of state, leaving behind the house that had once symbolized our fresh start. These days, we spend Christmas in a small Mexican village where our now teenage son and his younger sister enjoy tamales instead of turkey. The holidays are simpler but still filled with love, a reminder that, despite the pain of the past, I refuse to let the darkness win. This happened last year in North Carolina, and it's the reason I no longer go camping alone. At the time, I was enrolled in summer classes and ended up with a long weekend in July. I figured it was the perfect chance to explore some of the wilderness in the Carolinas. After searching online, I found a state forest with a promising trail. I told my roommate and family about my plans and shared the trail details before heading out. Near the forest entrance, I came across a small outdoor store frequented by hikers along a popular trail system. I stopped in to buy a map, thinking it might come in handy. The shopkeeper mentioned a lesser-known trail with a beautiful creek and swimming spot. Intrigued, I asked him to mark it on the map. It was outside the forest boundaries, but he assured me it was worth it. I texted my roommate and family about the change in plans, parked my car, and started hiking. I planned for a 3-day, 2-night trip with the creek as a side destination. The main trail was busy with other hikers, and I enjoyed chatting with a few of them. But as I ventured further from the primary paths, the crowd thinned. By early afternoon, about 3 miles from my target location, the environment became eerily quiet. No birds, no insects, not even a breeze. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. When I reached the creek, it was lovely, though not as spectacular as I'd imagined. Still, the swimming hole was inviting. I took a refreshing dip before drying off and setting up camp nearby. As I prepared my campsite, I couldn't shake the unsettling sense of being watched. The silence persisted, amplifying my unease. When night fell, I built a small fire and used my portable stove to cook dinner. The quiet was oppressive, and my instincts screamed that something was wrong. But I brushed it off and crawled into my tent to read before sleeping. The next morning, I woke up to chaos. My campsite was trashed. My gear bag had been cut down and its contents scattered. Oddly, none of the food had been touched. The rope securing the bag had been sliced cleanly, not chewed. And then I noticed them, bare footprints circling my camp. I was miles from the nearest road. My pulse quickened as I heard a branch snap nearby. When I turned, there was nothing visible, but then I heard whistling, the same tune I'd been whistling the day before. Only this time, it sounded menacing. Panic set in. I hastily packed my gear, ignoring proper storage. The whistling grew louder and seemed to come from all directions. Desperate, I yelled into the forest, "Stop it! What do you want?" The whistling ceased, replaced by a chilling silence. Then I heard my own voice mimic me, distorted like an old recording. I froze, terror coursing through me. I flung my pack on and bolted down the trail. It followed me, alternating between whistling and repeating my words, staying just far enough away to keep me terrified but unsure of its location. Then, as suddenly as it started, it stopped. I paused to catch my breath, but before I could recover, an ear-piercing shriek erupted right beside me. I didn't turn to look. I just ran. After sprinting for what felt like ages, I stumbled upon another pair of hikers. They saw the fear in my eyes and asked if I'd screamed. I explained everything, and they decided to avoid the area I'd come from. Together, we made our way to a busier trail. Once back at my car, I drove straight to a ranger station and reported what happened. Unfortunately, since the site was outside park boundaries, the rangers couldn't do much but agreed to pass the information along. When I was right at the edge of the woods and getting into my SUV, I heard a haunting tune coming from the trees just ahead of me. I don't think I've ever driven so fast in my life. When I got back and told my housemate why I'd returned after only one night, all he said was, "Man, I'm never camping with you again." Later, we decided to explore a reportedly haunted place during the daytime. There's an old cemetery near Redwood Valley that people say is eerie, so we chose to check it out. We wandered around the graveyard, and nothing unusual happened. Feeling underwhelmed, we left. This cemetery is located along a road known for strange occurrences. Legends say a woman dressed in white tries to hitch rides with unsuspecting drivers. I'd forgotten about that until later. As we drove further, the road led into a forested area. A couple of miles from the cemetery, we saw a place to pull over and walk along a hiking path. The spooky road wasn't on my mind anymore, so we decided to check out the trail. We started our hike in the afternoon. About 10 minutes in, we came across some abandoned train tracks and an old, crumbling bridge that used to carry trains over them. The structure looked intriguing, so we climbed down a slope near the bridge to check it out from below. We spent some time exploring and admiring the remains of the bridge before deciding to head back. The hill was steep, so we had to grab onto tree trunks for support as we climbed back up to the trail. Once at the top, we paused to catch our breath. That's when we heard it. A voice, angry and shouting, echoed faintly in the distance. It sounded like a man filled with rage, and the intensity was unnerving. The voice was far away at first, maybe more than 500 feet, but within seconds, it moved closer with unnatural speed. My brother and I looked at each other in shock. The voice was no longer distant. It was just down the trail, screaming in a language or gibberish we couldn't understand. My instincts screamed danger. Gripping large sticks, we prepared to defend ourselves, assuming it had to be some violent lunatic. We bolted down the trail, heading for the car. As we ran, the voice followed us, so close it sounded like it was right behind us. I glanced back, dreading what I might see, but there was no one there. Still, the furious yelling continued, as if it were chasing us. What happened next was the most chilling thing I've ever experienced. The voice seemed to surround us, moving in a way that defied logic. One moment it was directly behind us, then it was to our left, echoing through the trees. Seconds later, it was ahead of us, then to the right. Panicked, we sprinted as fast as we could, the voice pursuing us every step of the way. I began praying silently, asking for protection. When we were about halfway back to the car, the voice abruptly stopped. The woods fell eerily silent. Breathing heavily, we slowed our pace and exchanged terrified looks. "Did you hear it circling us?" I asked. My brother nodded, his face pale. We both agreed that the voice sounded like someone screaming in an incomprehensible rage. Once we reached the car, we jumped in and sped off without looking back. The drive was silent for several minutes as we processed what had just happened. That's when I remembered the stories about the haunted road, not just the cemetery. I had hiked that same trail alone months earlier, and nothing strange had happened. But this time was different, and it left me shaken to my core. I've never gone back to that trail, and have no intention of ever doing so. This is something I've kept to myself for a couple of years now, and every time I think about it, chills run through me. To give some background, my partner and I enjoy exploring new hiking trails in eastern Utah. One day, we decided to try out a path that wasn't on any official map and was pretty far from other trails. It was also a good distance from the nearest town. When we arrived at the trailhead, our car was one of the only ones parked there. Not long after we started walking, night fell quickly. We kept going until the moon was high in the sky, and I stopped to hug my partner for a romantic moment. Then out of nowhere, we heard rapid gunfire in the distance at least a few miles ahead. Pop, pop. Then silence for a few seconds. Pop, pop again. Now this wasn't completely unusual for the area. Even though it wasn't public land, I knew some people who used forgotten back roads to fire off rounds without getting in trouble. My partner asked if I thought it was gunfire, and I said I couldn't imagine it being anything else this deep in the wilderness. We decided it was better to head back. By this point, we had hiked about 2 miles and were standing on top of a large hill dotted with desert shrubs. As soon as we stopped talking, we noticed something unsettling. The insects had gone completely silent. Earlier in the hike, the sound of crickets had been constant, but now there was nothing. No natural noises at all. My partner was facing down the trail ahead, and I was looking back the way we came, ready to turn around. Suddenly, she screamed, staring past me, and bolted. I was already on edge, but figured maybe it was just some drunk local causing trouble. I turned to look in the direction she had been staring. What I saw made my blood run cold. I can't fully explain it, but it looked like a shadow, except it absorbed the moonlight rather than being illuminated by it. It was almost like a void. It was crouching when I turned, but it started to stand up slowly. When it finally stood to its full height, I realized I was looking up at it, and it was at least a foot taller than me. Its frame was gaunt, almost skeletal, but it wasn't human. We ran faster than I ever thought possible. The shrubs, which varied from 2 to 3 feet tall, blurred past us as we sprinted. The forest remained eerily silent the entire time. When we reached my car, I was so panicked that I didn't even notice I hadn't needed my keys to unlock the doors. We got in and sped off. Halfway home, the adrenaline began to fade, and we realized how deeply shaken we were. Every hair on my body was still standing on end. I've never felt anything like the terror that gripped me when I saw that thing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, and for a moment, I was almost frozen by sheer fear. Does anyone have any idea what we might have encountered? This was the scariest experience of my life, and I know it always will be. My family, along with some close friends of ours, planned a hiking trip to the Ozark Mountains. We had booked cabins at a campsite and mapped out specific trails to hike each day. The trip was set to last 4 days, and each day we had a new path to explore. The first 3 days were fantastic. We spotted plenty of wildlife, enjoyed each other's company, and shared lots of laughter. But on the 4th day, things took a chilling turn. We chose a trail that was more isolated and overgrown than the others. After about half an hour of walking, I was struck by a deep sense of discomfort that I couldn't shake off. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the uneasiness lingered. What's even stranger is that I started hearing singing. It was in a language I couldn't recognize. The melody was hauntingly beautiful, yet terrifying, like something straight out of the legends of sirens. The music chilled me to my core, but no one else seemed to notice it. I told my mom that something didn't feel right, but she brushed it off, saying I was probably just tired and that we'd rest soon. 5 minutes later, the singing grew louder, and my heart began pounding in my chest. Thankfully, we stopped to take a short break and have a snack. Looking back, I wish we hadn't stopped at all. A couple of minutes into our rest, the music became deafening. But then, just as suddenly, it stopped. Everything went eerily quiet. Everyone in our group, there were about 10 of us, turned their attention to the trees on our left. That's when we saw her. A tall figure cloaked in black stood barely visible among the trees. She was unnaturally tall, much taller than any person I've ever seen. Long white hair spilled out from beneath her hood, and though her head was bowed, I could still make out her face. Her skin was pale like old parchment. We stood frozen as she moved closer, stopping just at the edge of the trees. She lifted her head, and I swear, I'll never forget what I saw. Her eyes were pure white, no pupils, no irises. She had a sharp, narrow nose and lips smeared in a deep red color, though I didn't want to think about why. She stared at us for a moment before curling her lips into a sinister smile. Her smile was horrifying. She had no teeth. Then her eyes began to glow faintly. She spoke in a shrill, scratchy voice. "Leave this place while you still can. I'll be watching. Don't do anything foolish." I blinked, and she was gone. No one said a word. Even now, this is the first time I've ever shared this story with someone who wasn't there, and I've never discussed it with anyone who was there either. It feels good to finally tell someone about this experience. My uncle used to work as a deputy sheriff and participated in search and rescue operations in a remote area of the Pacific Northwest back in the late 1980s. This story is told from his perspective, with a few additional details provided by me for context. He specifically requested that I keep the exact location anonymous. It was the summer of 1988, and I was still somewhat new to my role at the county sheriff's office. Summers were always busy, as the influx of hikers and campers in the area often led to people getting lost in the wilderness. Although I was initially volunteered to join search and rescue efforts as a rookie, I grew to appreciate it. It gave me a sense of purpose, knowing I could help people in dire situations, a stark contrast to the otherwise routine life of law enforcement in our small town. One Tuesday morning, we got a call from a woman in New Mexico. She said her husband and their 10-year-old grandson had gone on a weekend camping trip up in our region. They had planned to return by Monday, but hadn't shown up, and she was deeply worried. We quickly organized a search team, including myself, for other deputies, a dozen local volunteers, and a pair of bloodhounds trained for rescue. By noon, we arrived at their campsite. At first glance, nothing seemed particularly out of place. The tent was still set up, and inside were their belongings: a wallet, truck keys, a map, and plenty of food and water. Outside the tent, a pot of water with soggy noodles sat over a long, cold fire pit. It looked like they had left in a hurry. There were no clear tracks around the site, so we gave the dogs a scent from a pair of socks left in the tent. The bloodhounds picked up a trail and led us north into the dense forest. My partner, Mark, and I exchanged uneasy looks. The woods beyond the camp stretched for miles in every direction, and we knew the search would be grueling. We worked methodically, using a grid search pattern to cover the area, but something strange kept happening. The dogs would pick up the scent in one section, but no trace of it could be found in the surrounding areas. It was as if the two had been randomly dropped into different parts of the forest. The unsettling nature of this realization left a pit in my stomach. By the end of the day, the team had covered nearly 3 miles. As dusk settled, most of the group decided to head back and regroup in the morning. Only Mark, his hound Rusty, and I stayed behind to continue the search overnight. I couldn't bear the thought of a child spending another cold, terrifying night out there. We set up camp in a small clearing, lit a fire, and laid out our sleeping bags. After discussing plans for the next day's search, we ate a quick dinner and settled down for the night. I lay on my back, staring up at the stars until sleep finally overtook me. Sometime later, I woke up abruptly. The clearing was quiet, but I had a gnawing sensation that someone or something was watching me. I sat up and scanned the dark tree line. "Hello," I called out. "If you're out there, we're here to help. Say something." No response. I lay back down, trying to shake off the unease, but moments later, I heard it, a sharp, unmistakable wolf whistle coming from the woods to my left. I jumped up, heart pounding, and shone my flashlight in the direction of the sound. Rusty was alert now, too, ears perked and whining softly. Mark stirred awake as I called out again, identifying myself as law enforcement and asking if anyone needed help. Another whistle echoed through the trees, this time from the opposite direction. Mark grabbed his knife and stood beside me as we scanned the area. After several tense minutes with no further signs of movement, we decided to rekindle the fire and wait until dawn. At first light, we searched the area thoroughly. In the damp soil near the clearing, we found 2 sets of boot prints. They seemed fresh, but didn't lead anywhere definitive. As we began the trek back to the trailhead to regroup with the others, we heard it again, 2 wolf whistles, this time in unison, coming from behind us. Spinning around, I saw them, 2 figures silhouetted against the morning sun at the edge of the clearing. "Hey, wait!" I shouted, starting toward them, but Mark grabbed my arm. "Think about it," he said. "We're looking for a grown man and a child. There's no way that second figure is an 11-year-old unless he's grown a foot overnight." I froze, the realization sinking in. Mark was right. Those weren't the people we were searching for. I reluctantly agreed to let them go, not wanting to put either of us at unnecessary risk. The rest of the hike back was uneventful. We reported everything to the sheriff and the rest of the team. While some scoffed, the sheriff seemed to take our account seriously, even assigning one of the deputies to carry a rifle during future searches. Over the next 12 days, we combed the forest, but never found the missing grandfather and grandson. Several searchers reported hearing wolf whistles during the mission, though I never heard them again myself. To this day, the events of that search still haunt me. I can't help but wonder who or what those silhouettes were, and whether they had anything to do with the disappearance. Stay safe out there. The world is full of strange and eerie mysteries. This event happened about 10 years ago, when I was 16. My family, my parents, my younger sister, and I had just moved to a rural area in southern Virginia. The house was surrounded by woods, which was a big change from the suburban neighborhood we used to live in. One of the best parts about our new home was its proximity to my grandparents' place, just a few minutes away. We had a small number of neighbors, one of whom was a man named Ray. His property was across a gravel road from us, though across the road really meant about half a mile down a heavily wooded lane. Ray was friendly and even invited me to hike and explore the forested land he owned. For someone who loved the outdoors as much as I did, this was a dream come true. Hiking and hunting had always been a big part of life in this region, and I was eager to explore. One Saturday morning, I persuaded my 12-year-old sister to come with me on an adventure. She wasn't as keen on exploring as I was, but eventually she agreed. After letting our parents know where we were headed and promising to be back by a specific time, we set off. I grabbed my jacket, a pair of binoculars, and my bright yellow cap, important for safety during hunting season, and we started walking. We made our way to Ray's house and told him we were heading into the woods. He reminded us to be careful, and with that, we began our hike. The terrain was challenging due to the hills, but the beauty of the forest made it worth the effort. About an hour in, we stumbled upon a narrow, well-trodden path winding through the trees. Curious, we decided to follow it. After walking for about 15 minutes, we spotted a hunting stand, camouflaged among the trees. It was October, and hunting season had recently begun, so I was glad I had my yellow cap for visibility. I climbed up the stand to get a better view and noticed what looked like a house in the distance, about 300 yards further into the woods. Intrigued, I suggested we check it out. My sister hesitated, but eventually agreed. As we got closer, we came upon an old rusted SUV partially hidden off the trail. A little farther ahead, up a small hill, stood the house, a dilapidated shack with peeling paint and boarded-up windows. A faded tarp covered parts of the roof, and an abandoned swing set stood nearby, rusted and falling apart. The air around the shack carried a strange, pungent odor I couldn't identify. My sister was visibly uneasy and wanted to head back, but I convinced her to let me take a quick look around. As we circled the building, I noticed a small camper and an old pickup truck parked behind it. Nearby were barrels, hoses, backpacks, and coolers. Smoke drifted out of the camper, and the smell intensified. It wasn't the smell of something dead, but it was sharp and unnatural. We crept closer, and I heard loud voices coming from inside the camper. That's when it hit me. This might be an illegal operation of some kind. The realization sent a chill down my spine. I whispered to my sister that we needed to leave immediately. Keeping calm, we started to backtrack, but before we could get far, one of the men inside shouted. I turned to see him pointing directly at us. Panic set in as the men began yelling and waving guns. I quickly stuffed my yellow cap into my pocket, realizing it had made us easy to spot. Moments later, they unleashed a large dog, a massive black and tan beast that looked like a Doberman mix. It barked furiously as the men gave chase. We ran as fast as we could, zigzagging through the forest. The shouts and barking grew louder, and I knew we couldn't outrun them for long. Thinking quickly, I told my sister to hide. We found a fallen tree and squeezed ourselves against its trunk, covering ourselves with leaves and branches. I ran a short distance away to toss my cap across a nearby stream, hoping to mislead them before returning to hide beside her. The men and the dog got closer, and we held our breath as they passed by, just a few yards from our hiding spot. One of the men picked up the cap and muttered something before they headed off in the wrong direction, further away from where we needed to go. After waiting in silence for what felt like an eternity, we emerged from our hiding place and made a beeline for Ray's house. When we arrived, he immediately noticed our frightened faces. Without asking too many questions, he offered to drive us home, which we gratefully accepted. We kept the incident a secret for years, afraid that telling anyone might get us in trouble or prevent us from exploring the woods again. It wasn't until much later that I finally shared the story with my parents and Ray. They were shocked but dismissed it as a case of kids being overly imaginative. I knew better. Those men weren't hunters. They were dangerous. The area has since been cleared, and new homes are being built where the forest once stood. While I still love hiking and being outdoors, that experience taught me to be far more cautious in my adventures. I remember an odd event from my childhood that still makes me question reality. It wasn't the scariest thing I've experienced, but it was definitely strange. As an adult, I haven't gone hiking or exploring much due to work, family, and other obligations. Occasionally, I still make time for it, and the nostalgia always hits hard. I try not to dwell on the unsettling memories from those days, but they creep up sometimes. Just the other day, I was driving through a tunnel when the car radio cut out, producing that familiar static. You know the sound when the signal disappears. That crackle made my skin crawl, triggering a vivid memory from when I was just 9 years old. This is where the real story begins. It was a crisp autumn afternoon, the leaves vibrant with color. My best friend Ben and I were hanging out in the backyard of my family's home, which bordered a large stretch of forest. We hadn't explored all of it yet, and were always eager to dive deeper. At that age, we were obsessed with playing soldiers. We had everything. Walkie-talkies, pocket knives, camo backpacks, and airsoft pistols. We'd spend hours pretending we were on secret missions. That day, Ben teased me about my school crush, saying, if you asked her to be your girlfriend, she'd totally say yes, before urging me to play another round of our favorite game. Reluctantly, I agreed. Ben declared he'd be the one to capture me first. I sprinted into the woods, picking a tall tree to climb. From up there, I could hear the soft rustling of leaves and distant bird calls. I turned on my walkie-talkie, waiting for Ben's signal. While perched on a sturdy branch, I spotted a deer grazing nearby. It hadn't noticed me yet, and I sat quietly, watching. That's when the static from my walkie-talkie began. It wasn't the usual kind. It was louder, more erratic. High-pitched tones broke through the crackle, and suddenly, the deer bolted. I felt an eerie stillness settle over the woods. The usual sounds of nature had vanished. My walkie-talkie emitted a low, guttural growl that sent shivers down my spine. Frozen with fear, I listened as the noise faded, leaving complete silence. Panicked, I turned off the device, climbed down from the tree, and ran back to the house as fast as I could. When I reached the yard, Ben was there, looking worried. My parents were frantic on the phone with the police. As soon as my mom saw me, she hugged me tightly, asking where I'd been. I stammered, unable to explain. Apparently, I'd been gone for hours, even though it felt like only a short while. Ben insisted he had tried contacting me through the walkie-talkie, but heard nothing back. After searching for a while, he'd run to tell my parents I was missing. I couldn't understand why we hadn't been able to communicate, even though we'd stayed on the same channel. And how had I lost track of time? None of it made sense. After speaking with the police, my parents banned us from going into the woods without supervision. A week later, Ben told me something he hadn't shared before. He admitted that while searching for me, he saw someone who looked exactly like me standing among the trees. From a distance, the figure had its back turned. Ben called my name and started running toward it, but the figure moved impossibly fast, taking a huge step away. When it turned around, Ben froze. It had my face, but with black, empty eyes. The figure smiled faintly and waved before standing motionless, staring at him. Overcome with dread, Ben sprinted back to the house, not stopping until he was safe. He didn't tell my parents what he'd seen, afraid they wouldn't believe him or that he'd get in trouble. Even telling me took a lot of courage. We've kept this secret between us all these years. I still don't know what happened that day, but I've never been able to forget it. I've come up with countless theories, but none seem plausible. I avoided those woods for a long time and never ventured far into them again. My parents still live in that house, and though I don't visit often, I've been thinking about returning to see if anything has changed. If I find the courage to go back and anything unusual happens, I'll share an update. I didn't really start exploring the forest trails until my family got a dog when I was about 15. She was a golden lab mix, full of energy and always ready to go outside. Living in a quiet rural town, I often took her on narrow dirt paths winding through the woods. After almost a year of sticking to the same familiar routes, I started venturing off the main paths. My curiosity led me to discover open clearings, hidden groves, and dense clusters of evergreens where the ground was blanketed in dried needles. My dog loved these adventures, and honestly, so did I. One day, our wandering brought us to an unexpected place deep within the forest. It was a small, secluded pool of water, maybe 50 or 60 feet wide. The water was completely still and so dark it reflected like polished glass. No frogs were croaking, no insects buzzing. It was eerily silent. The only thing breaking the surface was a gnarled tree branch jutting out near the center like a skeletal arm reaching skyward. I stood there, captivated by the strange, almost magical sight. The soil around the pool was soft and muddy, so I stayed a few steps back. My dog, on the other hand, wasn't enjoying the moment. She paced along the edge, whining and sniffing nervously at the damp ground. At first I thought she was just reacting to the water. She hated baths and would always try to avoid them. But then, out of nowhere, she let out a sharp, piercing bark that made my ears ring. I shushed her, worried her noise might attract unwanted attention. But she didn't stop. Instead, she moved behind me, barking again and again, louder this time, quiet. I hissed, glancing over my shoulder, concerned someone might hear us. After all, I didn't know if this land belonged to someone. But before I could calm her down, everything changed. My dog froze in place, her ears perked, and her eyes locked on the pool behind me. I turned back just in time to hear a faint splash. Ripples spread across the water's surface, distorting its glassy stillness. The twisted branch that had been sticking out was gone. I edged closer to the muddy bank, straining to see into the dark water. Sometimes your imagination gets the better of you. You see shapes and figures that aren't really there. Maybe I thought I saw a pale, sunken face beneath the surface, staring back at me. Or maybe it was just shadows and reflections playing tricks in the dim light filtering through the trees. Whatever it was, it sent a chill down my spine. My legs acted before my mind could, and I bolted. The crunch of dead twigs and leaves filled the air as I ran, my dog sprinting alongside me. I didn't dare look back. I was sure that if I did, I'd see something standing at the edge of the pool, watching us flee. I'll never forget the camping trip I went on with my former wife, Sarah. It was early October, several years after we had separated. We were both in our late 30s and trying to mend things for the sake of our children. The kids weren't with us this time. This trip was just the two of us. It was her idea, a strange attempt to reconnect as friends. I agreed, hoping it might help us move past the resentment that had lingered for so long. We picked a spot in a remote area of Washington, a state neither of us had explored much. The site was near a thick forest at the edge of a mountain range. It wasn't an official campsite, just a secluded area I found on a hiking website. Promised solitude and natural beauty, the drive there was uneventful. Sarah and I had a few awkward silences, but managed to talk about work and the kids. By the time we arrived, the sun was dipping below the horizon. I parked the car in a small clearing near a trailhead, and we started unloading our gear. The air was cool, carrying the earthy scent of the woods. It felt serene, though I couldn't ignore the undercurrent of tension between us. The trail to the campsite was about a mile long. Sarah led the way with a flashlight while I carried the heavier equipment. As we ventured deeper, the trail narrowed, and I noticed how unnervingly quiet the forest was. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. It was unsettling, but I kept it to myself. I didn't want to sound paranoid. We reached a small clearing by a creek just as night fell. It was an ideal spot, flat ground, access to water, and surrounded by towering evergreens. We quickly set up the tent and started a small fire. Sarah sat by the flames while I went to gather more wood. The shadows from the fire danced on the trees, casting an eerie glow. Dinner was simple, canned stew and some crackers. We didn't talk much, but the silence felt a little less heavy. The fire crackled, and the stars were brighter than I'd seen in years. For a moment, I thought the trip might actually be a good idea, but then things started to feel off. It began with a faint sound, almost like a whisper carried on the breeze. I glanced at Sarah, but she didn't seem to notice. I dismissed it as my imagination and turned my attention back to the fire. But then it came again, a soft, distant noise that I couldn't identify. It wasn't an animal or the wind. It felt deliberate. I tried to shake it off, blaming the isolation for my unease. Sarah must have noticed my discomfort because she asked if I was okay. I nodded, not wanting to seem irrational. After dinner, we put out the fire and climbed into the tent. It was a small two-person tent, cramped and uncomfortable. The awkwardness of being so close was palpable. As I lay staring at the ceiling of the tent, I listened intently to the silence outside. Then the noise came again, louder this time. It was a crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. My heart raced as I strained to hear. Another crunch followed closer now. I turned to Sarah, and she was already staring at me, wide-eyed. She'd heard it too. We didn't say anything, just lay there, listening. The crunching stopped, replaced by a low dragging sound. It came from the direction of the creek, moving steadily toward us. I grabbed the flashlight and switched it on. The beam lit up the tent walls but revealed nothing outside. I felt trapped, vulnerable. The dragging sound stopped abruptly, leaving an eerie silence. I stayed awake for hours, clutching the flashlight. Sarah eventually fell asleep, but I couldn't. My mind raced with possibilities. An animal, maybe a person. But who would be out here in such a remote place so late at night? The next morning, we found tracks near the creek. They weren't animal tracks, but looked like uneven boot prints. Whoever or whatever had made them had a strange gait. I tried to downplay it, suggesting it was an old trail someone had recently used. Sarah didn't look convinced, but we decided to stay another night. We spent the day hiking and collecting firewood, trying to stay busy and forget about the tracks. The forest was beautiful in the daylight, with sunlight filtering through the trees, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. The tracks were a constant reminder that we weren't as alone as we thought. That night, we built a bigger fire and stayed up late, talking about anything to fill the silence. I kept my knife close, a small comfort against the growing dread. As the hours passed, the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees felt taller, the shadows darker. Then around midnight, we heard it again, the crunching. This time, it was unmistakable. It came from the direction of the trail, deliberate and steady. Sarah froze, her eyes locking with mine. I grabbed the flashlight and pointed it toward the sound, but the beam couldn't reach far. The crunching stopped just beyond the light. We sat in silence, waiting. Then came a new sound, a low, guttural moan. It wasn't an animal, but it wasn't human either. It sent a chill through me. The moan came again, louder, closer. Sarah gripped my arm tightly. We had to leave. Grabbing the essentials, flashlights, the knife, and car keys, we hurried down the trail. The fire still burned behind us, casting faint light on the path. The trail seemed darker than before, the trees pressing in. Every step felt heavier, the darkness suffocating. The moan came again, closer than ever. I turned the flashlight toward the trees. For a split second I saw it, a hunched figure misshapen just beyond the beam. It moved, and the light caught a metallic glint. My stomach dropped. It wasn't an animal. It was a person holding some kind of tool or weapon. We ran. Sarah was ahead of me, her flashlight bouncing wildly as she sprinted. My breath came in ragged gasps, my heart pounding. I didn't look back. I couldn't. The moan followed us, low and menacing, vibrating in my chest. When we reached the car, I fumbled with the keys, my hands trembling. Sarah yanked the door open and climbed in as I started the engine. The headlights illuminated the trailhead, but there was nothing there, no figure, no movement, just the dark, empty forest. We didn't stop driving until we were miles away, back on the highway. Neither of us spoke. The silence was heavy with unspoken fear. Whatever had been out there wasn't something we could explain. It wasn't right. I never went camping again. Sarah and I never discussed that night, and our relationship stayed distant. But sometimes late at night, I think about those tracks by the creek, the guttural moan, and the glint of metal in the trees, and I wonder if it's still out there, waiting. I had worked under Laura for about 2 years. She was one of those managers who balanced being firm yet reasonable, always pushing us to deliver our best, but never demanding anything she wouldn't tackle herself. Laura wasn't someone who took vacations often, so I was caught off guard when she invited me to join her and her dad on a camping trip in Central America. I didn't know much about her dad except from her stories. A resilient man who had raised Laura and her younger brother after their mom passed away. It sounded like a chance to connect with Laura outside work and perhaps earn a few bonus points with her. We planned to camp near a remote area in the hills of western Honduras. Laura had been there years ago and described it as breathtaking. Pristine rivers, dense greenery, and a clear view of the mountains. It sounded like an adventure, so I eagerly agreed. Our journey began with a flight to Tegucigalpa, where we rented an old Jeep to take us deep into the countryside. The drive took hours along narrow roads that snaked through steep cliffs and thick forest canopies. Laura drove while her dad, Henry, navigated, and I sat in the back seat, marveling at the scenery, though an odd sense of unease started creeping in as we ventured further into isolation. By the time we reached the closest small town to our camping site, the sky had begun to dim. The town was tiny, just a scattering of modest houses along a dusty road. We stopped at a corner shop for last-minute supplies. The storekeeper, an older woman with weathered skin and sharp eyes, watched us quietly as we stocked up on water and snacks. "You camping nearby?" she asked Laura. "Yeah, just a little way up the trail," Laura answered, her tone light. The woman didn't respond right away, then simply nodded, her expression unreadable. Something about her silence unsettled me, but I brushed it off. From there, it was another 20 minutes of bumpy driving before we reached the dirt path leading to our camping spot. The Jeep struggled over the rugged terrain, but eventually, we arrived at a clearing surrounded by towering trees. The area felt untouched, timeless. We quickly set up our tents as the last glow of daylight disappeared. Laura's dad lit a small campfire while we unpacked. By the time we were finished, the stars were scattered across the sky like tiny gems. The silence of the forest was overwhelming, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of leaves or a distant bird call. That night, we sat by the fire eating canned food and swapping stories. Henry shared tales of his childhood in rural Guatemala, and Laura and I laughed about amusing moments at work. It felt comforting, yet a nagging sense of being watched lingered at the back of my mind. I chalked it up to nerves. It was a remote forest, after all. As the fire burned low, we turned in early. Inside my tent, I lay awake for a while, listening to the forest sounds. At first, it was soothing, the chirp of crickets and the hoot of an owl. But then I heard it, a faint crack like a branch breaking underfoot. My chest tightened. Probably an animal, I reassured myself, though the sound came again, this time closer. I held my breath, listening intently. Then came another sound, a low guttural noise, almost like a growl. Panic surged through me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it against the fabric of my tent, but the light revealed nothing unusual. After a while, the noise stopped, but I barely slept for the rest of the night. The next morning, I didn't mention what I'd heard, not wanting to sound paranoid. We spent the day hiking narrow trails through the forest, Laura pointing out various plants, and Henry entertaining us with his dry humor. By the time we returned to camp, dusk was setting in. After dinner, as we sat by the fire, Laura suddenly stood, her body tense. "Did you hear that?" she asked, her voice low. Henry and I exchanged uneasy glances. "Hear what?" I asked. "Footsteps," she said. I strained to listen, but heard only the crackling fire and distant forest hum. "You're imagining things," Henry said dismissively. Laura didn't respond. She grabbed her flashlight and swept the beam through the trees. It revealed nothing, yet the uneasy feeling from the previous night returned, stronger than before. We decided to turn in early. As I lay awake, the sounds began again. Soft, deliberate footsteps circled our campsite, slow and cautious. I held my breath, clutching the small pocket knife I'd packed, terrified to move. The footsteps paused, then resumed, each time making my pulse race. Once I thought I heard faint whispering, though I couldn't make out the words. By the time dawn broke, the noises had stopped. The three of us emerged from our tents, bleary-eyed and shaken. "Did you hear it?" Laura asked in a hushed tone. I nodded, too rattled to speak. Henry's face was grim. None of us wanted to stay another night, so we packed quickly and began the hike back to the Jeep. The forest seemed heavier that morning, the air oppressive. Every snap of a twig made me jump, and I couldn't shake the sense that we were being followed. When we reached the Jeep, a wave of relief washed over me, until we found a pile of rocks blocking the trail ahead. They hadn't been there before. We stared in stunned silence. "Who would do this?" Henry asked, his voice trembling. None of us had an answer. Laura tried to reverse the Jeep, but the trail was too narrow, so we had to get out and move the rocks ourselves. The forest was eerily still, yet I felt eyes on us the entire time. Finally, we cleared the path and sped away, heading straight for a larger town with a decent hotel. That night, lying in the safety of a real bed, I couldn't shake the memories, the footsteps, the growl, the whispers, and the pile of rocks. None of us spoke about the trip afterward. Laura and Henry seemed eager to forget, and I didn't blame them. But sometimes, late at night, I think about those eerie sounds and the oppressive silence of the forest. I still don't know what or who was out there. Maybe some mysteries are best left unsolved. I was 29 when I decided to go on my first solo camping trip. It was mid-November of 2017, and the trees were glowing with brilliant shades of orange, gold, and red. Months of working long hours in a small, stuffy office had drained me, and I desperately needed a break. time away from the constant buzz of technology, the crowds, and the never-ending noise of the city. My plan was straightforward. Pack my gear, drive to a remote area, and spend a weekend in peace under the stars. The location I chose wasn't an established campsite. It was deep in the woods of central Vermont, a place I'd come across during a hike earlier that summer. It was private, yet not completely inaccessible, just what I wanted. I parked my car at the end of a dirt road, shouldered my backpack, and began the 3-mile hike to the clearing I'd picked. It was far enough to avoid casual visitors, but not so isolated that I couldn't find my way back. The air was crisp, and the satisfying crunch of dry leaves underfoot made the walk feel refreshing. By the time I reached the site, the sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting long, soft shadows over the forest floor. The spot was as beautiful as I remembered, nestled among towering evergreens and bordering a narrow brook that shimmered in the fading light. I set up my tent near the water, rolled out my sleeping bag, and gathered a good pile of firewood to last through the night. Everything felt calm, almost perfect. As darkness settled in, I lit a small fire and sat beside it, letting the warmth seep into my chilled hands. The forest came alive with quiet sounds, the occasional rustle of leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, all gentle reminders of how far I was from the chaos of my daily life. After a simple dinner cooked on my portable stove, I lay back and gazed at the vast sky full of stars. Around 10 p.m., I crawled into my tent, zipped it shut, and snuggled into my sleeping bag. The night air was cold, but my bag kept me warm. The soft murmur of the creek lulled me into a deep sleep. I woke suddenly a few hours later, unsure of what had disturbed me. The forest was still, with only the faint trickle of the brook breaking the silence. My heart pounded as I strained to listen, trying to pick out any unusual sounds. Then I heard it, a faint crunching noise like footsteps moving through the dry leaves. I tried to convince myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon. I'd read about the local wildlife and knew there wasn't anything dangerous in these woods, but the sound was too regular, too deliberate. I stayed awake, holding my breath, my ears tuned to every sound. Eventually, the noise faded and exhaustion overtook me. The next morning, I reassured myself it had been nothing, a trick of the mind that darkness and solitude tend to play. The golden morning light filtering through the trees helped ease my nerves as I cooked breakfast. The world felt normal again. That day, I spent hours exploring the woods, following the brook, and collecting more firewood. During my wanderings, I stumbled across old tire tracks on a narrow trail about a half-mile from my campsite. They were faint, as though they'd been there for years, and I didn't give them much thought. As the sun began to set, I returned to my camp, ate dinner, and lit the fire again. The air was noticeably colder that evening, and I wrapped myself tightly in a blanket as I watched the flames dance. The stars seemed even brighter, but the forest felt heavier, darker. I went to bed early, hoping for an uninterrupted night's sleep. Around midnight, I woke again. This time, the crunching was much closer. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The sound moved steadily, circling the edges of my campsite. It paused occasionally before resuming its methodical pacing. My mind raced. Could it be another camper? A hunter? But why would they be sneaking around at this hour? I stayed motionless in my sleeping bag, gripping the small knife I'd brought for emergencies. The footsteps eventually stopped, but the unnerving sense that I wasn't alone lingered. The following morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. At the edge of my camp, the leaves had been disturbed, revealing patches of bare earth. Among the marks were footprints, unmistakably human. My pulse quickened as I hurriedly packed up my gear, deciding it was time to leave. But as I was breaking down my tent, I noticed something else. About 10 feet away, a tree had been slashed with 3 deep marks, too clean and precise to be caused by any animal. I didn't waste any more time. I threw on my backpack and began the hike back to my car, keeping a brisk pace but resisting the urge to run. The woods, which had felt peaceful when I arrived, now seemed sinister. Every rustling leaf or snapping twig made me flinch. About a mile from the car, I saw something that froze me in place. Tied to a tree along the path was a strip of bright blue cloth. It fluttered lightly in the breeze, and it looked fresh, as though it had only recently been torn. I hadn't seen it on my way in. My instincts screamed at me to keep moving, and I obeyed. When I finally reached my car, relief washed over me until I noticed the muddy smudges on the driver's side door handle. Long streaks of dirt trailed down it. I didn't stop to investigate. I jumped into the car, locked the doors, and sped off down the dirt road without looking back. Even now, years later, I can't fully explain what happened during that trip. I tried to convince myself it was just some prankster or a hunter who didn't realize I was there. But deep down, I know it wasn't that simple. I haven't gone camping alone since. It was late summer in 2020, and I had decided to try hammock camping for the first time on a solo trip. I had been yearning for a break from the stress of work and life, and I thought a weekend alone in nature would be the perfect escape. I chose a secluded camping area near the Shoshone National Forest in western Montana because of its rugged beauty and remoteness. I'd read about the breathtaking scenery, how the stars seemed close enough to touch, and how the silence could clear a crowded mind. But there's a fine line between peaceful solitude and unsettling isolation, and I discovered just how thin that line could be when you're alone in the wilderness, swaying in a hammock. The drive to the forest was uneventful, though a strange tension crept over me when I stopped at a small roadside gas station. The man at the counter, an older fellow with weathered skin and a sour expression, didn't speak as I paid for my gas. He just stared at me as if I didn't belong there. Outside, a group of locals leaned against a rusted pickup truck, smoking and watching me with wide, unblinking eyes. Their stares made me uneasy, but I brushed it off, telling myself I was reading too much into it. Not everyone has to be friendly, I thought, and I got back into my car, shaking off the strange vibe. I arrived at the trailhead in the late afternoon. The campground was nearly empty, with just a couple of older camper trailers parked in a corner of the lot and a single tent set up near the riverbank. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of pine and damp soil, and the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the faint murmur of the river. It was exactly what I'd been looking for: quiet, private, and serene. After hiking about a mile from the main lot, I found a spot that felt secluded but not too far off the path. 2 sturdy trees in a small clearing were the perfect anchors for my hammock. It took some trial and error to get the straps secure, but I eventually got it right. I set up my sleeping bag inside, unpacked a few essentials, and got my camp stove ready to make dinner. By the time the sun dipped behind the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees, I was finally starting to relax. As night fell, the air turned chilly. I crawled into my hammock, zipped myself into my sleeping bag, and draped the mosquito net over me. It felt snug and oddly comforting, like being wrapped in a cocoon. The gentle swaying of the hammock and the steady rhythm of the wind in the trees lulled me towards sleep. I don't know what woke me, maybe the distant hum of an engine or a subtle shift in the air, but I opened my eyes, disoriented. The forest was pitch black, the kind of darkness that feels almost oppressive, like being submerged in water. The faint glow of stars barely filtered through the tree canopy above. Then I heard it, a low rumble growing louder, like the sound of a dirt bike or an ATV. My chest tightened as I realized it was coming closer. Suddenly, the engine noise stopped. The silence that followed was jarring, and then I heard it, the crunch of boots on dry leaves. Someone was walking into my camp. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze. Every muscle tensed. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, each one closer than the last. Whoever it was wasn't trying to be quiet. I couldn't see them, but I felt their presence. It was undeniable and uncomfortably close. The steps halted about 6 feet from where I lay. My hammock, which had felt like a safe haven just hours before, now felt like a fragile trap. I lay paralyzed, my fingers gripping the edges of the fabric as I stared straight ahead. The faint outline of a figure stood in the shadows, a dark silhouette against the dim starlight. I couldn't make out who or what it was. My mind raced through a flood of possibilities. A park ranger? A lost hiker? Or something far worse? My thoughts spiraled into every horror story I'd ever heard. The seconds dragged into minutes, and the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. I couldn't hear it breathe, but I could feel its attention, heavy and sharp. Finally, the figure turned and walked away, its footsteps crunching as it retreated. Moments later, the engine roared back to life, much closer this time, before fading into the distance. I lay in my hammock, trembling, trying to process what had just happened. When dawn finally broke, I hadn't slept a minute. The golden light filtering through the trees made everything seem less threatening, but the fear from the night lingered. My legs were shaky as I climbed out of the hammock and inspected the campsite. Nothing seemed disturbed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I packed my gear quickly, eager to leave. The hike back to the lot felt endless, every sound in the forest making my heart pound. When I reached the trailhead, I half expected to see someone waiting for me, but the lot was empty except for my car and the same trailers from the day before. As I drove away, relief slowly replaced the tension in my chest, though a deep unease lingered. The wild beauty of Montana that had once called to me now felt different, more foreboding. The unsettling stares at the gas station, the figure in my camp, the eerie silence of the forest, it all added up to a place that felt unwelcoming. I swore to myself I'd never camp alone there again, at least not without better preparation. Even after I returned home, the experience stayed with me. I tried convincing myself it was just a ranger making rounds or a harmless hiker, but deep down, I knew better. Whatever or whoever had been standing just 6 feet away from me that night didn't feel right. It felt like something out of place, as if I were the intruder in a world I didn't belong to. And maybe I was. It was late August 2016 when my husband and I decided to take our 2 kids, Sophie 10 and Liam 8, on a camping trip to the Blue Ridge Mountains in Virginia. Though we had camped several times before, this was our first time visiting this particular area. We selected a campsite near a creek at a well-known campground deep in the woods, surrounded by towering oaks and rugged terrain. The creek's rushing waters created a soothing, yet oddly foreboding background noise. When we arrived, the campground was bustling with activity. Families were setting up tents, and groups of young adults laughed around campfires. At check-in, a ranger greeted us and gave a firm warning: make sure to store your food properly. Either hang it high or use the bear-proof lockers provided. Bears have been active in the area recently. We had brought along a sturdy rope and had read about hanging food bags securely. After setting up our spacious 6-person tent, which barely fit all of us and our gear, I found 2 solid trees about 20 feet apart near our site. Following the ranger's advice, I tied the rope, hung the food bag, and pulled it up until it dangled about 10 feet off the ground. It swayed slightly in the evening breeze, but it seemed secure. The kids, filled with excitement, ran around the campsite while my husband and I completed our preparations. By the time dusk fell, we were tired but pleased with our setup. The creek's gentle flow mingled with the distant sounds of laughter and crackling campfires. We gathered around our own fire, roasting marshmallows and telling goofy stories. When the flames dwindled, we crawled into our sleeping bags inside the tent. Sophie and Liam fell asleep almost instantly, their breathing steady and soft. My husband and I stayed awake a bit longer, whispering about how refreshing it was to escape the daily grind. Eventually, the calming sounds of the creek and the forest lullabies pulled us into sleep. I couldn't say what time it was when I woke up, but the air in the tent was cool, and the night was eerily quiet except for the creek and a faint rustling of leaves. Something had disturbed me, though I couldn't tell what. I lay still, listening intently. Then I heard it, a dull thud followed by a heavy thump-thump on the ground just outside the tent. It sounded like something or someone was jumping. My heart raced, and I nudged my husband awake. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, groggily. He opened his eyes and tilted his head to listen. The sound came again, deliberate and loud. Something was definitely moving just outside. Grabbing the flashlight, I unzipped the tent door cautiously and shone the beam into the darkness. There it was, a bear, a large one standing under our food bag. Its dark, glossy coat glistened in the light as it jumped, powerful legs propelling it upward, paws swiping at the bag, which swung just out of reach. The bear landed with a heavy thud, shook itself off, and leapt again. My husband joined me, his breath catching as he spotted the animal. We exchanged a wide-eyed look but said nothing, watching as the bear continued its attempts. It was strangely fascinating to see its determination. The bear crouched low, studied the bag, and sprang up, missing by mere inches each time. Its grunts and heavy breathing echoed in the night. After a while, though, the initial fear wore off. It was clear the bear wasn't going to get the bag, nor was it interested in our tent. Without a word, we zipped the tent back up and lay there, listening to its efforts until sleep eventually overtook us once more. Morning light filtered through the tent, waking us naturally. The kids were still sound asleep, sprawled across their sleeping bags. My husband and I stepped out into the crisp mountain air. The campground, now serene, belied the chaos of the night before. But as we walked over to retrieve our food bag, something unusual caught our attention. Several other trees around the campground were littered with torn ropes, and scattered packs lay shredded on the ground. It seemed the bear had been busy after we'd gone back to sleep. While it hadn't managed to get our pack, it had raided several other campsites. Around us, people were waking up to the aftermath. A group of young campers was frantically searching for their gear, which had been ripped apart and dragged into the woods. Probably didn't hang their food high enough, my husband muttered under his breath. Our food bag was untouched and secure, so we began making breakfast. As the smell of coffee and oatmeal wafted through the air, we watched the teenagers scour the area, their frustration evident. One muttered something about using the lockers next time, a hard lesson learned. For the rest of our trip, bits of conversation about the bear floated through the campground. Some campers packed up and left early, unwilling to risk another encounter. Others doubled down on their precautions, meticulously inspecting their food storage. As for us, we finished our trip without further incidents, though the memory of that jumping bear lingered. It served as a stark reminder that nature is unpredictable, and that it's always better to be overprepared. When we returned home, Sophie couldn't stop telling her friends about how we had outsmarted a bear. Liam, however, took to sleeping with a flashlight beside his bed. Each of us came away with our own takeaways from the experience, but one thing was certain: we'd never forget that trip. It was late July 2016, and my brother-in-law, Steve, and I had planned a camping trip deep into the forests of eastern Ontario, near a secluded stretch of Algonquin Park. This was a tradition we had started a few years earlier, a way to leave behind the hustle of daily life and reconnect with the wilderness. The region was renowned for its thick woods, clear lakes, and diverse wildlife. I had always found the isolation to be part of the appeal, but after this trip, I came to understand how it could also be a source of peril. We trekked for hours to find the perfect spot near the edge of a small, serene lake. It was remote, quiet, and surrounded by towering spruce and fir trees. The area was everything we'd hoped for, peaceful and untouched. The only sounds were the chirping of crickets, the occasional splash of fish, and the wind rustling through the branches. We pitched our tents at the edge of the tree line, not far from the water. The rest of the day was spent fishing, wandering the area, and soaking in the solitude. By evening, we were gathered around the campfire, cooking a simple meal and swapping old stories as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in hues of amber and crimson. When the stars emerged, we decided to call it a night. I crawled into my tent, slipped into my sleeping bag, and soon drifted off to sleep, lulled by the haunting calls of loons echoing across the lake. Sometime during the night, I was startled awake by a loud crashing sound. At first I thought it might be a tree falling nearby, but as I sat up and strained to listen, I realized the noise was coming from Steve's side of the campsite. It sounded like something enormous was stomping around. My heart began to pound as I unzipped my tent and peeked outside. The moon cast a faint glow over the campsite, and at first I saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed movement near Steve's tent. A hulking shadow loomed over it, an animal larger than I thought possible. My breath caught as I recognized it. A moose. I'd heard tales of how unpredictable moose could be, especially during certain times of the year, but nothing had prepared me for the sheer size and presence of one up close. It stood taller than I imagined, with long, lanky legs and antlers so wide they seemed to scrape against the low-hanging branches. Moss clung to its antlers like tattered decorations, and I could see the steamy puffs of its breath in the cool air. Without warning, the moose stepped forward. its massive hoof catching the edge of Steve's tent. The fabric crumpled under its weight, and the entire tent collapsed in an instant. I heard a muffled shout as Steve was knocked to the ground. The moose didn't seem to notice and continued its slow march toward the lake. I scrambled out of my tent, heart pounding. Steve was tangled in the flattened remains of his tent, struggling to free himself. When he finally emerged, he was clutching his side, his face pale and tight with pain. "Are you okay?" I whispered, my voice low, as if raising it might bring the moose back. Steve didn't answer immediately. He stared after the moose, which had waded into the shallow water. Its antlers glistened as it dipped its head to drink. Even standing knee-deep in the lake, the massive animal looked unreal, its deep grunts reverberating through the still night. Finally, Steve exhaled sharply and lowered himself onto a nearby rock. "I think it bruised my ribs," he said through clenched teeth. By the dim light, I could make out a large, angry bruise forming on his side. I helped him sit, my hands shaking from the adrenaline. Just a little higher, and the moose's leg could have crushed his chest. A little lower, and his arm might have been snapped. We sat silently watching the moose. It moved with slow, deliberate steps, its antlers dripping as it splashed around in the lake. For a moment, despite the terror of the encounter, I couldn't help but marvel at its raw power and grace. It was a humbling reminder of how untamed the wild truly is. After what felt like an eternity, the moose began to move again. It left the lake, water streaming from its legs, and lumbered off into the forest, disappearing into the shadows. The heavy thud of its footsteps gradually faded, leaving the night eerily quiet. Neither of us slept much after that. Steve's tent was destroyed, so we rigged a makeshift shelter using a tarp and some spare rope. Every rustle of leaves or distant snap of a twig had us on edge. By morning, Steve's bruise had darkened, and he winced with every step as we packed up. We decided to cut the trip short and make our way back to the car. The hike out was grueling. Steve had to stop often, his breathing labored. When we finally reached the trailhead and loaded into the car, the sense of relief was overwhelming. "I think I'll stick to cabins next time," Steve muttered as we drove away, his voice tight with pain. Couldn't blame him. That night, the wilderness taught us both an unforgettable lesson. Nature is beautiful, yes, but it's also unpredictable and dangerous. While Steve's injuries were minor compared to what could have happened, the experience changed the way I approach camping. Now, whenever I venture into the outdoors, I find myself scanning the trees more often, my ears tuned to every sound. Algonquin remains one of the most stunning places I've ever been, but that night, it showed me how indifferent nature can be to our plans or our safety. It was my boyfriend Carter and I's first fall living together in our new home. I wanted to surprise Carter by decorating the place with fall and Halloween-themed decorations before he got home from work one day. I thought it would be cute. I bought a few things from a nearby Marshall's and a few other stores, and I also looked on different apps and websites, most notably Facebook Marketplace. I simply typed in fall decorations, and one listing really caught my attention. It was a picture of a big green plastic container, which contained a bunch of fall decorations. I clicked on it for more details, and more or less it said, "Everything must go. Entire container of fall-themed decorations for sale for cheap." The price was only $20. It was a steal if that entire big container was full of decorations. At the bottom of the ad, it also said, "Selling other stuff, clearing out house, everything must go, check my profile." So I clicked his profile, looked at some of the other listings he had. There was a weird assortment of things this guy was selling. An allegedly new iPhone for $700, a few articles of women's clothing, and Christmas decorations. There were others, but I didn't go through all of them. The profile itself was kind of low-key. Everything was private. The man's name was Cody, and his profile picture was a close-up of a gray trucker's cap on a guy's head, but his face was covered by the brim of the hat. The cover photo was a blurry photo of a lake. I messaged the profile, and he replied instantly. I asked what kind of decorations were in the container, and he said all sorts. Tableware, outdoor decorations, etc. So I excitedly told the man I would come by them today if he were available. He confirmed he would be around later on, closer to 9 p.m., as that's when he'd get home from work. He sent me an address. I looked up the address on Google Maps Street View. It was not in the best town, honestly, but the house looked completely normal. 2 cars in the driveway in the Street View picture, lawn kept nice. So I agreed to meet. I had my friend Sally come with me just to be safe. I went to pick up Sally across town, and we were off to this Cody person's house. It was a half-hour drive. Sally and I had some time to catch up on the drive there. When we got off the highway, entering the town that the house was in, Sally started half-joking around about how sketchy the area was. I say half-joking around because I know she was saying that partially to be funny and make light of the situation, but also because everyone just kind of knows this really isn't the best town. It was dark out though, so honestly, we didn't see much besides streetlights, traffic lights, and some storefronts. As we got closer, I saw my phone screen turning on as it vibrated in the cup holder of my car. At the next light, I checked my phone and saw that it was messages from Cody on Messenger. He said, "When you get here, you can come right in." I showed it to Sally, and she said, "What the hell?" We both could agree that that was a bit uncomfortable and that we'd ring the doorbell anyway. We pulled up to the house, and surprisingly, there were no cars in the driveway. There were dim lights on in the house, though, that could barely be seen through the closed blinds of the windows. I messaged Cody back saying, "We're here? Can you come to the front?" Sally and I both watched the house as I waited for a response, and then we both noticed at the same exact time, at one of the windows, the blinds slightly shift, indicating someone was watching us through them. Then, just as quickly as we noticed it, the opening in the blinds closed. A few seconds later, the front door opened, and Cody messaged me back, saying, "I'm at the door. You can come in." It was a bit of an unsettling situation, and I was just happy I brought Sally along. The 2 of us got out of my car and walked closer to the front door. Before getting too close, I called out Cody's name a few times, only to get no response. Sally whispered we should leave. I took a few steps closer and said Cody one more time really loud, and there was no response. I turned and whispered, "Let's go," and we started walking back to the car when suddenly I heard a guy say, "Hey, yes, I'm here inside." We turned and saw a man at the doorway, but only about half of him. He was like peering only half of his body around the door. He waved us inside. Sally and I cautiously turned back and started walking back to the door. As I got closer, he fully opened the door, but then also walked out of view. We walked up the steps and into the house, keeping the front door open, and right away got hit with a strong scent, like that cotton scent from an old person's house mixed with something very unpleasant. We heard fast and heavy footsteps moving away into another room, followed by his voice saying, "It's over in here. Come here." His voice was freakishly deep, like it was intimidating. I made sure Sally was right by my side before entering the adjacent room. We were faced with a very weird sight. A dimly lit living room with a depressing pinkish-red carpet and really old-looking furniture. But the smell in this room was putrid. It smelt like actual death. In the middle of the room was a red container with a green lid on top of it. There was this Cody man standing just over the container. This was the first time I got a good, clear look at the man, and he was not a friendly-looking man. He invited me over to come open the container. I took note of the fact that this container was not the same color as the green container that was in the picture on the Facebook ad. It also was a completely different shape from the looks of it. I asked him to open it himself, and he said, "Well, you're no fun." That comment already had Sally and I inching backwards in the direction of the front door. But when he lifted the lid off the container and we were suddenly blasted with another putrid smell, we turned for the door and left in a hurry without looking back until we got to the car. Sally kept telling me to hurry up. By the time my car was on, all I know is the front door to the house was already closed. I don't know if he was watching us through the window again. We were gone very quickly. We never actually saw what was in that container. It was definitely not decorations, though. After telling Carter about all this, he asked for the address of the place, and I told him not to go there. He assured me he wouldn't. He just wanted to look up the house, so I gave it to him. The next day, he returned home later than usual from work, and he told me he stopped by the house, and an older woman answered the door, insisting that she lived there alone. He knew I wasn't lying, though, because I showed him all the Facebook messages with the guy, which included the address. Upon looking up the records of that address, it does list the owner as a woman in her late 60s. This was an incredibly disturbing and unexplainable experience. From now on, when buying stuff online, I avoid going to people's houses. It was 2019 when this happened. I remember specifically because it was the year I was living on my own in Asheville, North Carolina. I moved here for a temporary job, and it was an excuse for me to live on my own for the first time. I was 22 years old and just out of college. I had an apartment in downtown. I could walk to most things I needed, but I also had my car for when I wanted to branch out or venture out of town. The thing I loved about Asheville and North Carolina in general was the sheer amount of hiking trails. I'd been to many around town, but one I hadn't been to was DuPont State Forest. One day I decided to go. The drive was just under an hour from Asheville. It was a random Wednesday in October. The leaves were starting to change, and it was the perfect time for a hike. I didn't have work that day, and it being a work day for everyone else, it meant I'd probably have the trails all to myself. I got to the parking area for the park, and I found where one of the trails began. I walked for a while, and the trail was serene. I was the only one out there that day. It was a cloudy day, and we'd been getting a lot of rain that week, which was more of a reason I wanted to go, because the trail would lead to some nice waterfalls called Triple Falls and High Falls, and the waterfalls would be more impressive after a few days of rainfall. I only had to hike about 0.4 miles before getting to the Triple Falls, which was a really cool sight. A little piece of trivia: a scene in the Hunger Games was filmed at this waterfall. I took a few videos and pictures as I sat on a rock for a bit. I noticed a woman in the woods on the trail. She was looking at me. I waved at her, trying to be polite, and she just turned around and slowly walked deeper into the woods until she was out of sight. Not really something I gave a second thought to. Anyway, I wasn't tired yet. I had literally just started hiking, so I didn't sit for too long. I got up and headed back to the trail. I didn't want to try climbing the rocks of the waterfall because they were incredibly slippery. I continued to ascend up the trail and eventually came to the higher point of the falls called High Falls. I took a few more videos and pictures here and sat on another dry rock for a bit. I swear I felt a sense of deja vu when I saw that woman again in the woods by the trail. Once again, she was staring me down. I didn't wave this time. I instead looked down at my phone, pretending not to notice or care. I couldn't help but glance up after like 10 seconds, and now she was gone. If I had to guess, the woman was like 55. She had short, grayish blonde hair from the looks of it, but again, she was pretty far away, so this was all just what I saw of her from a distance. I didn't see which way she went, but whatever way it was, I wanted to go the opposite. I kept walking the direction I'd been walking and eventually came to another landmark of the trail, the covered bridge. I once again stopped here to take a scenic video and a few photos. I drank a bit of my water and then looked at the end of the bridge from the side I had just walked from. I saw that woman. I swear I didn't see her there before I started taking videos and pictures. I also didn't hear anyone walking behind me. She was once again staring right at me as if I were doing something wrong. I was getting annoyed. I started walking over to her and said, "Excuse me," but she just turned around and started walking away. Actually, the speed at which she was walking away for someone at her age was unsettling. I almost felt concern at the possibility that she may have been somebody with special needs that needed help. But I didn't convince myself to go chasing after her. I just leaned on the edge of the bridge for a few minutes before deciding to turn back. I had already been hiking for about 45 minutes, and it would take another 45 to get back down to the car. Walking back down the trail, I came in the direction that woman had gone. I passed a younger woman walking her dog, so I decided to stop her and ask if she'd seen an older woman pass by. She said no, and just trying to make conversation about it, talk to somebody about it. I told her how I kept seeing that woman popping out of nowhere and looking at me and just walking off. She laughed and said that's really strange. I didn't want to take up too much of her time. So after we both shared a laugh about it, I continued on my way. The entire way down the trail, I grew a bit paranoid that I'd see that woman lurking around in the background somewhere again. But all was quiet on the way down. I passed one other person who gave me a friendly smile and a nod. Other than that, I made it back to my car undisturbed. Later that day, I went on a date with a girl I was seeing there. We went to our favorite local bar to get some pumpkin spice beers and watch baseball. I told her about the woman on the trail and she found it amusing because honestly, it did sound funny. After that, I went home. Fast forward to that night when I was in bed. I hardly ever wake up in the middle of the night. I'm a pretty heavy sleeper normally. So me waking up in the middle of the night in the dark was unusual. I was still coming to when I heard something at the foot of my bed. I looked up and saw the figure of a woman at the foot of my bed. I felt as though my insides had just fallen out of my body. I started screaming so loud that I'm sure my neighbors could have heard it even with the windows closed. I started crawling against my headboard, trying to distance myself as much as possible from the female figure at the foot of my bed. Then she just turned and walked out of the room. I stopped screaming now, more so trying to just catch my breath and slow my rapidly beating heart. I flicked on the lamp and started shouting, "Who's there?" I listened, but there was dead silence. I grabbed the knife I had in the nightstand next to my bed and jumped out of bed. I flicked on every light switch I passed until the entire apartment was lit up. There was no one there. Not in the closets, not behind a couch, not under any beds. So I called my father. I didn't know what else to do. I needed to share what just happened with somebody. My father groggily picked up the phone, and after explaining to him, he said I must have hallucinated it while I was still in my half-asleep state. He said I wasn't fully awake yet, and so I could have been seeing things. I knew deep down he was probably right, but it didn't make the image I saw any less real-looking or horrifying. And then I told him about the woman in the park and how the figure at my bed actually resembled her. He said if anything, that further proves his point, that my brain conjured up a familiar image from earlier that day. Somehow I went back to sleep that night with my bedroom door barricaded with my dresser, just in case. It wasn't until 2 days later that I heard from my mom that her sister in Germany died. I'd never met my aunt. She'd been basically estranged from my mom, as she hadn't left Germany in over 25 years. My mom and uncle flew to Germany to attend the funeral, and it wasn't until she got back home and I saw the prayer card with my aunt's face on it that once again I felt like my organs dropped out of my body when I realized she looked identical to the woman I saw on the trail that day and hallucinated at the foot of my bed. This story shook my whole family, especially because I told my dad about all of it and the hallucination before we even got news of my aunt's passing. I was born a Catholic, but never found myself to be super religious after confirmation. But goddamn, does this really send shivers down my spine and make me question what exactly I believe in. My friend Carlos and I like to do stupid things together. We've been friends since we were 10, and when we were 21, we became roommates. We lived in Brunswick, Georgia, where we grew up. A little coastal town that had its pros and cons, but overall was an okay place to grow up. But it got boring as we entered our 20s. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. While we did live there, we knew about a creepy-looking house that differed from the rest of the houses in town, and that it looked like it was built in a different century. It had long been abandoned, and we and our friends would make up stories about its history. It was mid-October, and everyone was in Halloween mode. People were doing Halloween-themed activities like haunted houses and corn mazes and such. We thought it would be fun one Friday night to go break into that house and explore. So after we were both home from our jobs, we both grabbed baseball bats to bring with us, stopped for some fast food and beers on the way, and drove to the house. We parked all the way down the road just not to be suspicious. The houses around there were not that close together, so each property was pretty big, which meant we were less likely to get caught snooping around. We both grabbed a couple beers each and threw them in our backpacks. Not sure why we thought we were going to drink in there. But along with that, we stuffed our baseball bats into the sides just so no one would see us walking around with baseball bats in our hands late at night, looking like trouble. We quietly walked down the street, just whispering to each other. It took less than 5 minutes to get to the house. It was so dark on this part of the street, because this house along with the house across the street had no lights on. There weren't any street lights on the street. Whatever light there may have been would have had to come from one of the few houses with their lights on. From here on we used our flashlights we brought. The front lawn had a bunch of dirt patches, and the patches of grass were overgrown. Lots of weeds everywhere it seemed. We walked around to the backyard to look for an entry point, because doing that out front seemed stupid for obvious reasons. Shockingly, the back door was already unlocked. The place wasn't boarded up or anything. The back windows weren't even smashed. We knew that the place was abandoned though. Everybody did. We walked right in. Navigating inside of there would have been impossible had it not been for our flashlights. The house was bigger than some of the neighboring houses, yet the inside felt very cramped. Like there were a lot of rooms, but they were smaller, almost giving the house a maze-like feeling. Carlos stepped into another room away from me, and at that moment I was alone. I heard his voice say from another room, "Yo, there's still furniture everywhere." I responded, "Yeah, this place must have been abandoned in a hurry." Everything seemed ancient like furniture in my grandma's house, only not used in years. I walked around the first floor some more, and came to a tiny corridor with a few doors. Doors that led to bedrooms. I entered one of the bedrooms, and it was incredibly cramped. The bed took up 80% of the room. I went through some of the drawers in the dresser, but they all seemed like they'd already been gone through. Same with the closet. Anything left behind besides this old furniture just looked like junk. I heard Carlos say he's going upstairs. I said back, okay. We were speaking at a volume that was just loud enough for each of us to hear. After checking out the other bedroom down on the first floor, which was equally cramped, I went back out to the corridor. There were 2 other doors, one that led to a bathroom, and then when I opened the final door, I was looking down a long stairway to a basement. I decided, fuck it. I'm walking down. I started descending the steps, each step squeaking and cracking under my weight. I got about halfway down the steps when I realized there was a faint glow coming from down there. I turned off my flashlight, and yes, there was still a little faint glow coming from down there. I should have turned and left in that moment like any normal person, but I do stupid things. Like I die first in a horror movie most likely. I continued down the stairs with my flashlight off, and when I got to the bottom, I looked around the walls separating the stairs from the rest of the basement, and I saw what was just barely lighting up the room. It was 2 tall candles sitting on a table, but that wasn't the first thing I noticed. What I saw first was what was next to that, and it was some kind of sofa rocking chair, and it was rocking. Someone was seated in it. It was facing away from the stairway. All I could see was a hand on one of the arms of the chair. I had to get out of there. I started going back up the stairs as quietly as I could, with each crack and squeak causing me to cringe in fear. I was halfway up the stairs now. I looked back down and could still see the faint glow of the candles. So I continued as quietly as I could. I was almost to the top, and one stair creaked especially loud. I paused for a moment, clenching my teeth so hard. I proceeded up the final steps and made it to the top. I turned to shut the door, but I noticed it was pitch black down there now. The thought of the candles having been put out sent a shiver down my spine. I quietly closed the door, and then I tiptoed around this cramped maze of a house until I found the stairway going upstairs. I stood at the bottom of the stairs and quietly called up to Carlos. He wasn't responding. I sighed and started quietly going up the stairs, repeating Carlos's name. Still no response. I had to go all the way up to the top of the stairs repeating his name, and he still wouldn't respond. So I said, if you're trying to scare me, stop joking around. There's someone in the basement. We need to get out of here. That got his attention because he stepped out from a dark room and asked if I was serious. I told him I'd explain outside, but that I'm not kidding. He followed me down the stairs. I was trying less so to be quiet now, because I just wanted to get out of that house. We were heading back to the back door where we entered, but when we passed the corridor of the basement door, we both saw the silhouette of a man standing in front of the door. The time for sneaking around was over. I kept repeating, just go, as we booked it outside and ran for my car. We made it to the car in like 30 seconds. I was already winded by the time we made it back. I backed the car off that street and started driving us home. In the car ride was when I explained in detail what I saw. All Carlos kept saying was, yo, what the fuck, to everything I said. He was in just as much disbelief as me. So while no, I don't think anyone legally lived in that house, I do think someone was squatting in there down in that basement. Who knows who it was? Honestly, who cares? I just never returned anywhere near that street.